My name is Jacqueline Bossler. I am the president of the Caxton Club and a member of the advisory board for the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. It is my great privilege to introduce today's program. The Caxton Club has a tradition of sponsoring symposiums in conjunction with others. This year, our co-sponsor is the Chicago Botanic Gardens. We are delighted to be the co-sponsor of this event. It is now my privilege to introduce Leora Siegel. She is the Senior Director of the Lenhart Library, one of the treasures of the Chicago Botanic Garden. Its 150,000 volume collection encompasses resources on gardening, botany, plant conservation, and landscape design in every format, from rare books to ebooks. The library initiatives focus on public engagement, collections, and collaborations. Leora holds a master's degree in both library and information science and natural resources and environmental science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She is a fellow of the Linnean Society of London and serves on the board of the Chicago Collection Consortium and on the executive committee of the Caxton Club. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce Leora Siegel.
Hello and welcome to the Language of Flowers Symposium. I am so delighted that 500 participants from libraries, museums, gardens, and more from all over the world are here with us today. I'm Leora Siegel, Senior Director of the Chicago Botanic Gardens Lenhart Library, and I'm your host for today's program. So I'll start by sharing background on the project and the agencies and partners involved, and then we'll dive in. So the Chicago Botanic Gardens Lenhart Library is a research library with about 150,000 items in the collection, and that includes a botanical rare book collection. The general gardening collection can be borrowed and includes a range of subjects that's curated to reflect the mission of the Chicago Botanic Garden, which is, we cultivate the power of plants to sustain and enrich life. So this symposium has actually been in the work for several years. When it was first envisioned, it was going to be in person, in our auditorium, and a COVID quarantine was completely unimaginable. I'm so glad that we can offer this for free and virtually so that all of you can participate. About 4 years ago, we were fortunate to receive a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to digitize and conserve Language of Flower volumes, and we're now approaching the end of the grant work. So this symposium is presented as a capstone event celebrating the Language of Flower genre and its significance. And any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we do not have a conservation or digitization lab on site, so the specialized work was outsourced and conducted by the experts at the Northeast Document Conservation Center, or NEDCC, located in the Boston area. And it was founded in 1973, and it's a nonprofit devoted to the conservation and preservation of paper-based materials. And it provides services to institutions without in-house conservation facilities just like ours. So the last batch of books funded by this grant are now back from the NEDCC and in our rare book room, conserved and protected for the future. And the digitized images that were added to the Biodiversity Heritage Library were added just in time for this symposium. So the books selected for this grant were not previously digitally available. This project adds these works to the body of knowledge available to all for free around the world. The Biodiversity Heritage Library, or BHL, is the largest open access library for biodiversity literature. BHL is revolutionizing global research by providing free access to knowledge about life on Earth for climate change scientists, to taxonomists, to artists. And BHL operates as an international consortium of natural history, botanical research, and national libraries working together. The BHL portal provides access to over 59 million pages of primary source literature published between the 15th and the 21st centuries, and it grows every day with new editions. And since it launched 15 years ago, BHL has served over 10 million people in 240 countries around the world. And as a digital library, it's open during COVID and it's open 24/7. Also, its Flickr site has over 250,000 free nature images for us to use. The BHL portal includes collections that sort subjects together, and a language of flower collection is one of these. And it includes 148 titles with over 35,000 pages from the Lenhart Library, Cornell University Library, and other BHL partners. Further, BHL is a part of the Smithsonian Library and Archives, and it operates out of the Washington, D.C. area. So if you're not familiar with BHL yet, be prepared to lose several hours exploring the amazing resources just when you log in. And another partner I want to recognize for today's program is the Caxton Club. The Caxton Club was founded in 1895, and it brings together those who are dedicated to the books in all of its forms. The club publishes books such as its most recent Chicago by the Book, 101 publications that shape the city and its image, that was published in 2018, and it publishes the Caxtonian Journal. Through annual grants it awards, it supports students of the book arts, and through programs such as this, it provides a forum for learning opportunities. Lastly, 6 years ago, Mr. James Moretz, the retired director of the American Floral Art School in Chicago, donated 400 Language of Flower books to the library. And his gift gives the Chicago Botanic Garden one of the Midwest's best collections of literature on the subject. So I am grateful to the agencies and the partners and the dedicated staff in those organizations doing the work, and to my colleagues here who have been on this Language of Flowers journey with me for all these years. So shout out to Stacy and Amanda, and thank you. So now I would like to review the agenda. I will provide an introduction to the Language of Flowers. Then we'll hear the keynote presentation by Professor Ann Steyer on Speaking with Flora. After that, Mr. Brent Elliott will present Florography Deconstructed. Then we'll hear Stacy Stultz with Volumes on View. A live panel discussion follows that, and you'll be able to ask questions through the chat feature at that time, so jot down your questions as the program progresses. We've planned 5-minute breaks between each speaker and a 15-minute break between Brent and Stacy at about noon in Chicago, 6 p.m. London. You'll have a chance to stretch, grab a bite to eat, and your Zoom cameras are off, so you'll be able to munch while you watch. So let's jump in. Let's do a deep dive into all things Language of Flowers. So when we say Language of Flowers, what is that exactly? So we have many people coming in at different levels, so I want to give a baseline. So the Language of Flowers is a 19th century literary trend that intersects horticulture, botany, natural history, art, poetry, and women's studies. It has it all. Many dictionaries of flower sentiments or floral lexicons or florographies were written. Sentiments were assigned to flowers, and assembling specific flowers with those meanings into a bouquet was said to convey a secret message. One had to know the flower sentiments to impress the recipient of a bouquet rather than insult. So let's investigate this aspect of the Language of Flowers a bit more. And the books I'm sharing are from the collection of the Lenhart Library that are digitized and uploaded to the BHL. So florography is the Language of Flowers, and it is my preferred term, but it is not in the Oxford English Dictionary of the online edition. So if you know people at OED, let me know. Let's see if we can get it added. And if you haven't seen this before, this is a typical Language of Flower book. This is the title page of the Illustrated Language of Flowers by Mrs. L. Burke, published in 1858. And this is her florography describing flowers and sentiments. And I use her as an example throughout my talk. So here is a daffodil page. We see the illustration, we see a daffodil poem, and we see the sentiments. So in case you're on a phone with a small screen and not on a larger computer screen where you can see the detail, I will read you the poem. Fair daffodils, we weep to see you haste away so soon. As yet the early rising sun has not attained his noon. Stay, stay, until the hastening day has run but to the even song, and having prayed together, we will go with you along. So here from her Illustrated Language of Flowers is the daffodil page. On the left side, you see the list of flowers in alphabetical order, and on the right side is the sentiment list. So for daffodil, the sentiment is regard. And here is the page for hibiscus, and its meaning is delicate beauty. And for the lily of the valley, its sentiment is the return of happiness. So you get the idea, flowers and their sentiments. So that was part 1 of the book. In part 2 of the book, you can look up the sentiment that you wish to convey to get to the flower. For example, if you want to convey affection, it's a pear, so not a flower at all, a fruit. And for bashfulness, the flower is peony. And on the same page is beauty. Beauty delicate, which was our hibiscus, beauty divine, beauty rustic, beauty unconscious. So you can see these are examples of individual sentiments and flowers, the language of flowers. So we talked about combinations of flowers. In a bouquet shared, we're said to hold a secret message. So let's take a look at that. So this is from The Floral Offering by Frances Sargent Osgood, 1847. She has a beautiful, beautiful illustration of trumpet flower, the red in the center, forget-me-not, the light blue flowers on 3 stems that go out in 3 directions from the center, and the raspberry, the purple berries with the thorns towards the bottom right, and the pink leaves, pink flowers with the thorns towards the top left. And here are the secret messages. Farewell, be true to thyself, yet sometimes think of me. And Frances Sargent Osgood was rumored to have had an affair with Edgar Allan Poe. So is this message for him? Perhaps, but that's another subject. So it was not new to the 19th century that plants were assigned sentiments. We see plant sentiments in the Bible, to Shakespeare, and throughout literature. But this was trendy, it was a fad, it was a social media type of going viral event, and it was a publishing craze. So numerous volumes with similar titles were published in many editions. There were subtle differences from edition to edition, such as a slightly different bouquet. So for librarians out there, the phrase language of flowers is not a Library of Congress subject heading. You'll need to search flowers in literature, flower language, flower symbolic aspects, flower poetry, flower folklore, and the like to find the books you're looking for in the language of flowers. So I think we need to get that added to the Library of Congress subject headings listing. So interesting things about these books make them into a genre unto themselves. They can be identified by these properties, whether some of them or all of them. They contain the floriography and poetry and prose. They have similar titles. They may have ornamental covers. They are illustrated with flowers. They tend to be small size, and they may be published anonymously. So let's look at this in more detail. So we've just seen Mrs. Burke's floriography with her poetry, so we've looked at that. So let's look at some similar titles with ornamental covers. So about 60 titles in the BHL Language of Flower collection start with the letter L, and those primarily start with language of flowers, and they're primarily in English as well. So this is some examples. So this is a beautiful cover, Language of Flower is the title. Here's the Language of Flowers in that beautiful red with black tooling, beautiful blue. I love that deep shade of blue. The language and poetry of flowers illustrated in oil colors. That's interesting. The pages are actual oil colors. Here's the colored language of flowers. Here's artistic language of flowers, and floral poetry in the language of flowers. So similar sounding titles. So these books tend to be illustrated with flowers. Here, another example from Mrs. Burke, The Illustrated Language of Flowers. And this is an interesting aspect of the language of flower books, and leads us to a little more substance. So in general, in the 19th century, etiquette of that day, it was not seen as polite for Victorian women to work with reproductive parts of plants or botany. So no roots, no seeds, no plant parts are in these books. These are not botanical works, such as were written at the time. So the language of flower genre books illustrations are representations of a single flower, a bouquet, on stems perhaps, but not the rest of the plants. But hold on to that thought, because there are always exceptions. And further, Professor Steyer will discuss women in botany and literary versus scientific approaches to women and plants in her talk. So let's look at some more illustrated language of flower books. Here's the miniature language of flowers from Mrs. Burke in 1865, and her colored language of flowers from 1886. Now the books tend to be small size. The smallest in our collection is 3 inches, and many are in the 5-inch or 12 centimeter range. And the books are small, it was said, to fit into a woman's hand. It's also practical if they're small, because many were given as gift books, so easy to transport. And here is a somewhat bouquet of books, if you would. And published anonymously. This is interesting. So for library catalogers out there, there are a good number of books that are anonymously authored and have similar titles. So you can imagine if you have 20 books all called The Language of Flowers without authors, that can make the task of cataloging these a little challenging. So in the BHL Language of Flowers collection of 148 titles, that's what you're looking at here, I ran a search in author order, and 44 do not have authors listed. So that's about 1/3 of this subset of books. So BHL does not have a comprehensive set of these works, but the anonymous authorship is indicative of the genre. And this is interesting, an interesting part of this language of flower publishing trend, because in the 19th century, books published anonymously are indicative of being published by a woman author. And at this time, the publishing industry was male dominated. So this fad of multiple editions opened doors for women and offered an opportunity for them to author books as a creative outlet or to support themselves and their families. And of course, authors were also male, and women authors did publish under their own names, as we've already seen. So this anonymous aspect is just one part of the genre. So the books that we've seen up to now have been in English, and primarily published in London, Boston, and New York. So let's look at some other languages. So here is a Spanish language of flower book, published in 1882 in New York. And here is a French language flower book, published in 1842 in Belgium. So let's switch gears for a moment and talk about the physical books. Today, the language of flower books are fragile, with weak and failing bindings. They were printed around the 1850 mark in publishing, which saw the transition in paper from sturdy linen-based paper to paper made from trees, which is acidic. And this is what we use today. So over time, acidic paper is weaker and leads to crumbling paper, decayed spines, and books breaking down. Therefore, we need to conserve the works to preserve and protect them for the future, for use as primary sources. So here are a few before and after photos. And we're looking at floral, Francis Sargent Osgood, with floral offerings, as we saw before. So here the spine needs conservation, work among other things. Here, after the spine is now intact, it looks wonderful. So in the background of the photo is a gray phase box, which has been custom built for it. And the book is now in the temperature and humidity controlled rare book room. Here is another example. This is Lucy Hooper, and the front board is completely detached. And now after conservation, it's reattached and ready to stand the test of time into the future. And I would just note that these examples are some of the larger Language of Flower books that we have, but I wanted good photos for you. So now I would like to share 4 more variations of Language of Flower books so you get the full picture and why it was a fad, because they're a little fun. So this is the Language of Flower birthday book by Mary Keeble Grant from 1895. And the book lists the days of the year and assigns a flower and a sentiment to each, as well as a poem. So if your birthday is today, April 30th, happy birthday. Thank you for spending your day with us. Your flower is fuchsia and your sentiment is grace. Her laugh, and here is your poem. I want to read your poem. Her laugh full of life, without any control, but the sweet one of gracefulness wrung from her soul. And where it most sparkled, no glance could discover, in lip, cheek, or eyes, for she brightened all over. And that was by Sir Thomas More. Up next, this is the Lexicon of Ladies' Names by Sarah Carter in 1860. And it lists names in alphabetical order by name and then also by flower. And of course, my name's never included. But for example, here's the index of names on the left and the index of flowers on the right. So if your name is Agnes, your signification is modesty, your emblem is white violet, and your sentiment is modesty. If your name is Rowena, your signification is to acquire peace, your emblem is flowering reeds, and your sentiment is confidence in heaven. And there's poems for each page as well. Sarah Carter Edgerton Mayo, born in 1819, and she died in 1848, was an American writer who wrote 3 Language of Flower books: The Flower Vase, The Fables of Flora, and we're looking at Flora Fortune Teller. So this, The Flora Fortune Teller, a game for the season of flowers, is very creative. Readers are instructed to assemble a bouquet of 5 different color flowers, one each with white, blue, purple, yellow, and red, and each part reveals one's fortune based on the flower. And her key on the left side, she has 5 questions. 1, what is my character? 2, what is or will be the state or quality of my love? 3, what is or will be my worldly fortune? 4, what is the scene in which most of my life will be spent? 5, what is the character of my future companion? And the book contains poems and phrases of well-known writers such as Shakespeare, Tennyson, and Wordsworth. So for part 1, with the white flowers, you select one white flower to describe your character, and then you read the phrase. So for Hollyhock, the white flowers, and in Mrs. Mayo's words, the top part of the page is for the lady, and the bottom is for the gentleman. So on top we have a shop of all the quality that man loves woman for. And on the bottom we have a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. Those are both by Shakespeare. For part 2, with blue flowers, where your fortune is describing the state of quality of your affections. And for the blue flower, I chose Iris. So for the woman on top, we have, is it possible that love should of a sudden take such hold, by Shakespeare. And below, for the man, we have, she alone, heard, felt, and seen, possess every thought, fills every sense. And that's by Thompson. So that is a fun floral fortune teller book. So lastly, let's look at Lucy Hooper. Her title is The Lady's Book of Flowers and Poetry, to which are added a botanical introduction, a complete floral dictionary, and a chapter on plants and rooms. And it was published in 1845, but the original publication date was 1841. And remember when I asked you to hold a thought a bit ago, we were discussing proper etiquette for women, not doing botany and interacting with reproductive plant parts. Well, here's an exception. Lucy Hooper was born in 1816, lived to 1841. She was an American poet, and she combined floral poetry, horticulture, and botany into her book. So the title page is on the left side. It's quite a comprehensive title page, and this is typical of botanical works in this time period. And on the right, we're looking at her essay, Management of Plants in Rooms. It starts on page 11 and goes to 13. And it is early in the book, and it gives tips on how to grow houseplants and keep them alive. And it starts out with a quote, that first paragraph here, and I quote her, "Perhaps a few hints on the management of plants in rooms may not be unacceptable to our readers." And that's the end of her quote. So is she recognizing and calling out a horticultural botanical glass ceiling here? It kind of sounds like it. Then at the back of her book, tucked in on page 265, and described on her title page as a botanical introduction, she does introduce botanical concepts. She describes plant parts, calyx, corolla, filament, stamen, pistil, and she lists Linnaean classes. So Lucy Hooper is an exception, crossing over botany into the language of flowers. She's pushing the boundaries of the language of flowers into the botanical aspects. She's a woman in STEM in 1841, and unfortunately she died that same year. That was your introduction. Now you know the basics. There is so much more. An entire semester would allow us enough time to cover it all. But to recap, we looked at the language of flowers as a genre, with florography and poetry, similar titles, ornamental covers, flower illustrations, small size, and many published anonymously works. And language of flowers brought opportunities for women to move into the male-dominated publishing arena and to take small steps into male-dominated botanical circles. And so the language of flowers was certainly a publishing craze. Could it have been an actual craze as well? Well, I have many unanswered questions about that. Was there a robust enough flower industry in place to have blooms available to create these secret bouquets at all times? And what about the florographies with differing sentiments for the same flower? But regardless, there are some significant step forwards for women with this Victorian trend. So lots more awaits with the next fascinating sessions. We'll hear about women in horticulture, flora, the history of language of flowers, and many more volumes to view. So thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. And Rusty Steyer is Professor Emerita in Humanities, Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies at York University in Toronto, Canada. Her PhD was from Rutgers University in Comparative Literature, and her teaching, research, and writing have been on women and nature in historical and cultural perspectives. Her prize-winning book, Cultivating Women, Cultivating Science, Flora's Daughters and Botany in England in 1760 to 1860, which was published in 1996, has just been issued in a Chinese translation. She co-edited Natural Eloquence, Women Reinscribe Science in 1997, and Figuring It Out, Science, Gender, and Visual Culture in 2006. Her interest in visual dimensions of nature and culture has led into publications and ongoing research about Flora, the mythological goddess of flowers. A current work in progress is an interdisciplinary and edited collection about women and botany in 19th century English Canada. Welcome, Rusty.
I am Ann Steyer, and my topic is Speaking with Flora. I'm delighted to be part of this symposium in celebration of the Lenhart Library's project to digitize books in the form of 19th century writing known as the language of flowers. For a long time, I've been writing about what I call women and plants, a fruitful topic. I focused especially on women in botany, first in England and more recently in Canada. I'm interested in historical perspectives on women and nature, as well as in histories of botanical culture. I've especially been looking to give a fuller picture and a more complex picture of how women contributed to knowledge of plants and nature in a wide variety of ways, in print culture, through art, and as part of plant practices of many kinds. Who were the women, and how did they come to know about plants, flowers, and botany? Did they have access to plant knowledge and activities through family networks? Was social class their root in? Did they come in through schooling or through informal means? What kinds of activities did they do and where? Collecting wildflowers locally, doing watercolors in domestic settings, visiting botanic gardens, or on safari to exotic locations? Given the shaping hands of norms of gender, race, class, and ethnicity for women and also for men, how did women in particular pursue their interests in plants and flowers? The topic for this symposium is a large body of books about flowers from 19th century French and Anglo-American culture. Books in the language of flowers were a niche feature in popular writing at that time and a part of print culture from the 1830s through to the end of the century. They were issued widely by entrepreneurial publishers and reprinted often. They emerged out of a rich cultural soil. As artifacts from that time, they offer us a window onto many worlds, worlds of botany, poetry, gardens, religion, and the emotional culture of 19th century life. At least they offer these worlds to readers within literate and dominant classes who could participate in this popular fad. These books are often described as teaching how to convey personal messages by means of individual flowers and also through floral bouquets. A flower would communicate a sentiment or a thought on its own. And then, when combined with other flowers into a bouquet, could communicate further meanings depending on how each flower is arranged and how each flower is positioned in relation to other flowers adjacent to it. Researchers into 19th century language of flower books tell us that these books were meant to be pretty volumes, given as gifts and books for sharing within one social circle. Their primary audience is women, and their primary messaging has to do with love and personal relationships. Beverly Seaton, author of the book, The Language of Flowers, A History, shown here, published in 1995 and recently issued in paperback. That's the foundational book on this topic. Her book makes the point that books in this genre set out to teach readers about the meanings of flowers, but that the meanings are not all the same. She explains it this way, as shown on your slide. Every age writes its own language of flowers in its literature and its customs. Furthermore, she writes, what every age creates is a cultural myth, using nature to validate manners and morals. Thus, the floral messages in 19th century language of flower books are interwoven with moral and religious values of a time and imbued with gender norms for the 19th century about women, family, and domestic life that are associated especially with Victorian ideas of womanhood. I must admit that to my mind, language of flower books are a peculiar way of approaching nature in its floral and vegetative aspects. Preparing for my talk often felt like putting my toes into the water of a massive pond with layers of vegetation on the surface and especially below the surface. Dense strands of poetry, pieces of legends, emblems, gendered assumptions, and folklore, all entangled with scientific aspects. At this time, our time, in a pandemic world with racisms and violence of so many kinds around us, These books hardly seem pertinent and pressing as an object of attention. Yet they offer us an enormous cultural bouquet. They're a top line into 19th century topics that speak not only of their time, but also in some ways speak to ours. So the collection of books now made available to us through the Lenhart Library and through the website of the Biodiversity Heritage Library website, this collection is a treasure trove for reflection. It's a resource for which anyone interested in 19th century culture, book history, plant studies, women's studies, garden history, and art history can be very grateful indeed. And I'm sure it will stimulate further work about flowers, plants, and culture. To guide us through the layers of vegetation in this massive cultural pond, I'm asking two questions in this symposium talk. The first is, how do figures of women and ideas about women inform language of flower books? The second is, how do women in these books look when set against a backdrop of another figure, a mythological figure that brings together women and flowers from within a mainstream European cultural tradition? I'll be focusing on the figure of Flora, the goddess of flowers in classical Roman and Western European mythology. I have entitled my talk Speaking with Flora because I found that knowing about Flora, goddess of flowers, gives me a handle on language of flower books and on the 19th century world out of which they grew. At the end of my talk, I'll comment from a very 21st century moment on what we are saying about our relationship to nature when we say it with flowers. Language of flower books are about flowers, and they are filled with poems that speak to flowers, but it's notable that the flowers themselves are mute. That is, language of flower books don't speak with the flowers they celebrate. Are there lessons in here for us about our human relationships with non-human parts of nature? That is a question. I'll come back to it. So saying with flowers has a long history. So many flora motifs across the arts and in religious symbolisms across cultures. Among the hundreds of language of flower books in the Lenhart Library and on the Biodiversity Heritage Library site, most of them bring together flowers and poetry. The book entitled The Poetical Language of Flowers, or The Pilgrimage of Love, is a good place for me to start. It was first published in London in 1847. It went through numerous British editions into the 1870s and was issued in the US as well. Chapters on favorite flowers of the time, forget-me-not, pansies, daisies, the snowdrop, are a jumping off point for accounts of the emblematic meanings of individual flowers, and then of messages to be conveyed when different flowers are combined in floral bouquets. The page, The Violet of Valley, on my slide, lists emblems associated with flowers that are shown on the next and facing page. We read that the blue violet, shown in 4 positions on the illustration, the blue violet is an emblem of modesty. The white jasmine at the top left is an emblem of amiability. The moss rose at the top right means confession of love. And the pink shown in the center is pure love. Well, when grouped together as depicted in the plate, the flowers, we read, form a sentence that conveys a message that is shown on the text page, The Violet of the Valley, just under there. The message reads, "Your modesty and amiability have caused me to confess my love." Well, how, you may wonder, can this be? What accounts for the meaning of each flower and what accounts for the assemblage of them into a sentence? The author of this, Thomas Miller, explains that flowers are, quote, "the most beautiful objects in nature, messengers of friendship and love." Miller traces their language back to olden times in the Garden of Eden when, he writes, quote, the buds and blossoms held sweet converse together, end quote. And Miller gives his book a framing narrative. We learn there that love set out on a pilgrimage, hence his subtitle, to find long-lost companions who, quote, spoke to him in the old language of the flowers, giving him a new lesson every day. Love encountered the honeysuckle, for example, who, quote, told him how she was an emblem of devoted affection. And the daisies told him in sweet, unstudied syllables that they were the daughters of innocence, end quote. So, after this pilgrimage, Love decided to trust woman with the secret he had discovered about the meanings of flowers. In terms of literary history, books about the language of flowers developed in 17th and 18th century France and were connected to a type of writing known as sentimental flower books. These were for a female audience, and they linked flowers to women, romance, and courtship. These books presented poems about flowers and pictures of flowers in elegant formats as gift items for the genteel and fashionable drawing room table. The most influential of all these books was the book shown to the far right on my slide, that is Charlotte de la Tour, Le Langage des Fleurs, published in Paris in 1819, shown here in the 13th edition, circa 1856. Flowers are arranged by seasons of the year with poems and legends about them, and lists of flowers, they're called dictionaries, that are cross-indexed to their emblematic meanings. Through these resources, what are called these floral vocabularies, lovers could convey messages and hidden meanings to one another as part of flirtation and romance through codes, such as might also be communicated by fans or hat positions or a hand gesture or a handkerchief tucked one place or another, pointed one way or another. The popularity of the French language of flower books and their gift book format was a boon for publishers elsewhere. And Latour's book was widely adapted in England from the 1830s onward. Some authors and editors focused on romance aspects, others on visual features, and still others built on botanical interests of the time. It's notable, though, that many of the language of flower books published in England and America were refined and purified, their language, for their women readers. Romantic and flirty aspects were played down, and 19th century Anglo-American ideas about womanhood were brought forward instead, with attention to qualities such as delicacy, fidelity, and modesty. Consider, for example, The Bouquet, containing the poetry and language of flowers by a lady, published in Boston, 1845. I'm showing you the title page and also the adjacent page, which is called the Index of Flowers. Like so many of the others, this book is made up of poems about flowers by many different poets, and it focuses on the meanings of specimens. One illustration, I cannot show it to you here, illustrates is a white lily, and it's identified as Lilium candidum. And a poem is paired with it under the heading Purity and Sweetness. Now, purity and sweetness is not the poem's title, but rather it's the emblematic meaning of the flower as found in the Index of Flowers at the end. So if you look at the fifth line down, you will find the meanings, that reference to lily white, purity and sweetness. That's Lilium candidum. The meanings that you find on the page are more or less conventional, but all not the same, but more or less conventional across many of the language of flower books. So Lily of the Valley is delicate simplicity. Mignonette means your qualities surpass your loveliness. Moss is maternal love, and blue periwinkle signifies sweet remembrances. The Bouquet shows the authorship as by a lady, And Beverly Seaton found through her study that most of the American language of flower books were edited by women. Lucy Hooper's The Lady's Book of Flowers, shown at the right, is, The Lady's Book of Flowers and Poetry is another example. This book came out in New York in 1842 and was reissued in 1845 and again in 1868. It was the posthumous publication of a poet and essayist who also wrote for juvenile readers. As in other language of flower books at the time, poems are about the sentiment of flowers. Thus, a weeping willow is forsaken, and a water lily embodies purity of heart. But beyond those conventional emblematic topics, the full title of the book signals Lucy Hooper's interest in another prominent language of nature of her time, namely botanical language. At the end of a book of nearly 300 pages, we find a general account of botanical terms and a considerable exposition of Linnaean botany and of the classes and orders that make up the Linnaean taxonomic system. While the emblems and poetic sentiments found in literary, romantic, and Victorian languages of flowers are certainly one of the prominent languages of nature in 19th century writing, looking across the body of digitized material that is now available from these collections, we can see something else across these books that also is characteristic of that time, namely an empirical approach to nature. Language of flower books are inventories of plants and their meanings with descriptive features of flowers. Many, such as shown next on my slide, the Handbook of the Language and Sentiment of Flowers, published in London in 1845, present themselves as handbooks. Some of their titles are dictionaries and others prominently are lexicons. The author of the Handbook volume, Robert Tyas, was an author and publisher on popular floral topics. And this included adapting Charlotte de la Tour's French language of flower book for British audiences. But Tyas identifies himself on the title page of the handbook as FRBS. That's initials next to his name. And that stands for Fellow of the Royal Botanic Society. And he explains in a section called his Introductory Observations, also noted on the title page, that he wants to provide a key to the meaning of individual flowers so that his readers can, quote, become proficient in the science here taught, end quote. There's a focus on data in these books that connects them to the genre of the botanical flora. That is, to books that were a compilation of names and descriptive features of plants found in a given geographical area. Books such as botanist William Jackson Hooker's Flora Borealis Americana, shown in the adjacent slide, 1829 to 40, about plants found in northern parts of British America. Language of Flowers books do something similar by how they set out details of flowers and the vocabulary of flowers, as though they were giving diagnostic features of a botanical specimen. Overlapping interests in plants, flowers, horticulture, and botany were close to the heart of European and Anglo-American cultures across the 18th century, into Romanticism, and across the 19th century. These were times of plant explorations at home and abroad. These were times of plant explorations in colonies and empires. The enthusiasms of plant collectors were part of this, the development of botanical gardens, the popularity of natural history, the development of institutions to promote interest in natural history and sciences. In all informal ways, these were part of that world, and interest in flowers as art was integral to this history too, in drawing, watercolor, botanical illustration, as printed in new technologies and visible in multiple craft practices, embroidery, fabric design, wax flowers. Cultures of plants, flowers, and botany had enthusiasts from across a broad class range, from aristocrats to those across the middle ranks of society, from gentlemanly interest in botany to artisanal botany and natural history for working men, and from activities associated with fashionable leisure to those dedicated to self-improvement. Interest in science was a major legacy of the European Enlightenment, and one form it took was the development and spread of these interests through print culture and through popular education, notably for children and for women. Botany led the way on this, and women were the audience and also the producers of popularizing material for new audiences. So I'm showing you title pages of 4 examples of this. On the far left, Priscilla Wakefield, a Quaker writer in London, wrote Introduction to Botany, one of a number of introductory books on botany and natural history topics that appeared from the 1790s into the 1820s. She wrote her botany book in the form of letters between sisters, in which they shared what they were learning from a teacher. Another style of writing was a conversation between mother and children, through which a mother could impart the botanical knowledge that she had developed in order to teach her children. Books like these were part of the burgeoning market for instructional materials in both informal and formal education. In New York State in the 1820s, Elmira Hart Lincoln Phelps taught botany at the Troy Female Seminary, and she published her lectures as the textbook entitled Familiar Lectures on Botany. That's the second title page for you here, published in 1829 originally. And her book was used in schools for decades, as was another book that her Familiar Lectures on Botany that came out in a simplified version as Botany for Beginners in 1833. In England, John Linley, university professor, editor, and major discipline builder of botany, wrote for several levels of learners to introduce what he called the unscientific reader to new ideas about plant structure and classification. He chose the letter format for his book, Ladies' Botany, or A Familiar Introduction to the Study of the Natural System of Botany, came out 1834-37 in 2 volumes. His way of writing this was, however, still too elevated for some readers. And Jane Loudon, a professional popular science writer and magazine editor, stepped into this gap. Jane Loudon, also known as Mrs. Loudon, is perhaps better known to gardening people for her work with her husband, John Claudius Loudon, entrepreneurial garden designer and encyclopedic horticultural writer. But she had a significant career at mid-century in popular science writing. Notable here is her introductory book, Botany for Ladies, that came out first in 1842, written not in the older form of letters or domestic conversations, but in an expository style that would be familiar to us. This book was later reissued with the new title, Modern Botany, and that's the title page you see here. That came out in 1851. The new title was meant to reflect new emphases and directions in science culture, and it also signals a wider intellectual space for women beyond a sex-specific and feminized domestic sphere. Now, by mid-century, botany had become a part of the curriculum in schools for girls across the Anglo-American world. In late 1847, a group of students at a school in Canada, in this case, the Burlington Ladies Academy in Hamilton, and what then was known as Canada West, set out to raise funds for their school library by putting together a literary periodical that they called the Calliopean to, quote, contribute toward the intellectual and social improvement of our sex, to elevate the standard of female education in Canada, and thus promote domestic happiness and social virtue. Many of the articles in the magazine reflected debates of their day about women and their place in the world, and hence about education, religion, and social roles. One article from early 1848 was on the study of botany. First part of it is shown on the slide here. I've highlighted some sections on how they promoted botany. And you can read it, but I'll read it aloud as well. The study of botany is adapted to refine the taste and improve the heart, as well as please the eye. Perhaps no science more effectually combines pleasure with improvement. It calls the student forth to the garden, the field, the grove, along the banks of winding brooks, on the edge of precipices, the sides of mountains, and into the depths of forest, amidst the verdure of spring and the bloom of summer, to the charming retreats of nature in her wild luxuriance, or where she smiles under the hand of cultivation. To the female, this science particularly recommends itself. Surely no lady can investigate the perfect order of nature in the formation and growth of flowers without receiving lessons in regularity and system, traits so essential in the female character. The author then goes on to itemize other virtues of botanical study, stimuli to physical exercise and agreeable relaxation from mental toil and so on. And the author then continues, I've also highlighted this passage for you, but not least among the virtues of the study of flowers is their acknowledged influence upon the affections of the heart. Who can look upon that loveliest gem of the floral year, the violet, partially concealing itself in its leafy bower from the garish gaze of the sun, without feeling an instinctive yearning to imitate that beautiful symbol of retiring modesty, end quote. So, Language of Flowers books came into being and flourished within the historical and cultural frameworks I've been sketching and illustrating. Looking inside these books, we find an amalgam of languages of nature, poetic, artistic, botanical. 20th century readers like us might be surprised by the botanical information in these books, the Latin plant names, the instructional text, the glossaries, but 19th century readers of Language of Flower books would have been familiar with the cross-fertilizing we see here between more literary and more scientific approaches to plants. These books show an integrative approach to nature that was in fact a feature of 19th century natural history writing. We find it in other popularizations of knowledge for women and general readers too. The separation between humanistic and scientific ways of knowing was less acute across the middle part of the 19th century than it became later on. By the end of the century, botany had become its own discipline, with ever more specialized vocabularies, institutions, and credentials that marginalize popular and amateur practices. Nonetheless, the amalgam of literary, artistic, and scientific material continued to be part of the 19th century story of women, plants, and botany. It gave women access to knowledge of plants, and also it gave women ways to take part in floral practices of many different kinds. Now, thus far, I've been discussing some 19th century features behind the Language of Flower books with their associations between women and flowers. But associations between women and nature and women and plants are part of many cultures and societies and go back way before 19th century France, England, and America. So now I want to invite a new guest into our symposium to join us at our virtual table. I would like to invite Flora, the mythological goddess of flowers, to join us now. Flora steps into 21st century analysis, trailing millennia of associations. Representations of Flora, the goddess of flowers, who is the third figure you see from the right-hand side of your screen. Flora goes back to Roman antiquity. Representations of her go back to accounts of Flora by the poet and mythographer Ovid, order of the work Metamorphoses and the work The Art of Love and others, and comes forward from there into the Renaissance and across into the 19th century. Literary and artistic renderings of Flora over time show different aspects of this mythological and iconographical figure. Sometimes she's a composed spiritual presence, sometimes a joyous figure of abundance, sometimes represented as a canny sex worker in our terminology. She's also presented as a proud monarch and as a queen of love. Why, you may ask, bother with Flora? Precisely because Flora takes different shapes at different times and for different audiences. And it is for this reason I find that the figure of Flora as goddess can be used to show aspects of a period's attitude toward women who are associated with flowers. In fact, having a historical parade of figures of Flora as a backdrop gives me a visual field for reading 19th century language of flower books. She alerts me to gendered ideas about women and makes visible norms that the books put forward about women's nature. Books meant, I reiterate, for a certain niche market of middle-class women. Flora's history, when we turn to look at this, traces back to nature worship and agricultural-based rituals about the flowering of grain, vines, and fruit trees. Italic peoples, I have learned, celebrated her as a fertility goddess, and beginning in the 3rd century BC, Rome held public religious festivals in springtime. The dates were April 28th to May 3rd in their calendar, in fact, at the very time of our symposium, which maps onto their time. The Floralia, as these festivals were called, or also Games of Flora, were popular theatrical performances of cheerful sexiness by the sex workers of their day. These were intended to maintain the goodwill of the goddess Flora. For Roman poet Ovid, who tells of Flora in another of his writings, Flora was the mother of flowers. He was, she explains, once a beautiful Greek nymph of the happy fields named Chloris. The god Zephyr pursued and abducted her. He then married her and gave her power and jurisdiction over a wide domain. Ovid wrote that Flora scattered new seed across countless nations and brought color to flowers through her transformative powers of love and sexuality. Many literary and visual traditions developed out of Ovid's account. This slide shows you Sandro Botticelli's La Primavera, dating 1477-78 from the Italian Renaissance. This glorious painting illustrates the traditions that we meet in Ovid, traditions of Ovid within traditions of Flora, pardon me, within visual culture, as well as the challenges for interpreting imagery around this goddess figure. The painting shows a series of mythological figures as an allegory of spring. We see Venus, goddess of love, standing in the center of the piece in a garden filled with flowers and fruit, flanked on one side by, on the left, by 3 graces and the god Mercury, and on the other side, the right, by Flora and by the nymph Chloris being seized by Zephyr. Zephyr was the god of the wind. The figures tell a story that is generally understood as a series of actions that involve transformation, development, and fertility. Flowers issue from the mouth of Chloris on the right as she metamorphoses into Flora, and Flora's rounded belly in turn displays her fecundity, her power as she strews flowers from her lap. Art historians who study this painting have pointed out the particularity of the flowers on Flora's gown. They are identifiable, and they also carry symbolic meanings of many kinds. By contrast to the physicality of the group on the right, that is Zephyr, Chloris, and Flora, the three graces on the other side, on the left, on the other side of Venus, are figures of ethereal delicacy and decorum. We meet our mythological goddess again in publications about plants and flowers across later centuries as a cultural icon for numerous 17th and 18th century books, for example, about horticulture, medicine, and botany. John Rhee's Flora on the left, published in London in 1665, for example, promotes a desire for gardening among the gentry and aristocracy. And it was meant specifically to teach women how to bring fashionable spring bulbs into bloom. What you see on the engraved title page is a depiction of Flora as a queen seated on top on a pediment. As is conventional, her head is wreathed with flowers, and she holds bouquets of flowers in her hands. Below her, Ceres, the goddess of the grain, and Pomona, the goddess of fruit, stand as her maids of honor. As the goddess of flowers, Flora is sturdy in body and endowed with regal authority. She is a monarch who rules over all manifestations of vegetative nature. The position of the figures shows Flora's rank and significance, and so does her direct gaze as she activates the new season by the power of her eyes. That's a line from a section of the book. And here on the right is another 17th century Flora on the frontispiece of the Flora Danica, 1647 to 48. This beautiful piece is the frontispiece to a 3-volume herbal with illustrations of 400 Danish plants and their properties, compiled by Simon Pauli, botanist and teacher and physician to the King of Denmark. In this example, the frontispiece celebrates Flora's generative force and locates it in the power of her pen. Later in the next century, we meet Flora once again in the Botanic Garden, 1791, a long poem about science, botany, and the imagination, written by Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles Darwin. Erasmus Darwin was a medical doctor, writer, and poet, and also a translator of Linnaeus. Through this work, The Botanic Garden, Darwin aimed to cultivate knowledge of botany among readers, especially among women readers. And to this end, he introduced ideas about plants formulated by Swedish naturalist Linnaeus. Earlier in the 18th century, Linnaeus had taken up ideas about plant sexuality that were circulating in his time. And he made the male and female parts of plants central to his system of plant classification. Books about Linnaeus's ideas, Erasmus Darwin's book among them, went far to popularize botany and Linnaean botany for wide audiences deep into the 19th century. The Botanic Garden brings together poetry and prose, personifications and scientific information, and mythology and empiricism. Across the whole poem, and it's a hefty book, Darwin constructs an elaborate mythological apparatus to embody and express an overall vision of nature that is elemental, animated, and very dynamic. Part 2 is entitled The Loves of the Plants. And there Darwin puts the Linnaean system of botany into verse. He does this by personifying flowers as, you have a bit of a quotation, beaux and beauties who woo and win their vegetable loves. Focusing on sexual attraction and courtship in the vegetable kingdom, He illustrates the Linnaean classes and orders with reference to brides and bridegrooms and marriage beds and sexual couplings of multiple kinds. Linnaean botany was sexual and sexy. And the frontispiece chosen for the Botanic Garden, designed by artist Henry Fuseli, captures this well. Unlike John Ray's queenly flora, the flora on this frontispiece is young and self-possessed. Her body is alluring in its sinuous pose as she gazes into the mirror of fashion. The title of the image is, as I show you in the caption, Flora Attired by the Elements. And we see her surrounded by elemental forces, starting from the bottom left, that's meant to be earth, then air, the top left, fire above, and water at the right, as they prepare the goddess of flowers for her work visiting the plants that make up her kingdom. Erasmus Darwin thought that classical mythologies were too narrow. He was drawn instead to new style mythologies of a more romantic cast. Hence, the visions of fire and water, those figures are meant to be nymphs, and earth is meant to be a gnome, and its sylphs of the air is shown in the butterfly hat at the top left. And these are meant to recall Egyptian hieroglyphics and universal stories, we are told, that circulated among Babylonians and other early peoples. In that sense, Fuseli's image of flora naturalizes woman as embodied and elemental and ageless, we might say, quite primeval. But I don't see his flora as only a mythological figure from the past. I think Fuseli refashions her, mythologizes her, romanticizes her for his time. Her dress, her expression, and her pose would have a quite modern flavor for those who bought that book in 1791. She looks like a young woman who is sure of herself, studying botany and being up to date on art, fashion, books, and trendy conversation topics. Well into the 19th century, Linnaean ideas continued to be used to popularize botany as fashionable and accessible knowledge. Publishers climbed onto a botanical bandwagon, and book frontispieces of this time show this as well. Robert John Thornton's book, New Illustration of the Sexual System of Linnaeus from 1807, is one example. Known also as Temple of Flora, this was a lush and expensive portfolio of flowers in dramatic, romantic, and picturesque settings. And we find Flora and Cupid there in several illustrative plates. In the plate shown here, entitled Aesculapius, Flora, Ceres, and Cupid, honoring the bust of Linnaeus, Flora is not the queenly figure elevated above Ceres and Pomona in John Ray's 17th century book. Instead, she's depicted as demure and quite decorative, and her importance is subordinated, it seems, to the more utilitarian values of Aesculapius as the Roman god of medicine and Ceres as the goddess of the grain. Where has her power gone? Consider one further image of Flora from that time. This is the title page of William Mavor's Ladies and Gentlemen's Botanical Pocketbook published in 1800. This little book, and it is in fact a little book, speaks to the popularity of botany as an activity of gendered leisure. It is a pocketbook, as I say. It is a small volume that could be carried on botanical ramblings, and its pages are formatted with space for recording the details of plants that one might find in that activity. The author wrote that botany, quote, ought to rank very high in the scale of elegant acquirements, end quote, and the engraved title page reinforces this view. Here, we witness an encounter between Flora and a well-dressed man and woman. Flora sits scantily clothed with bare breasts and bare legs and with flowers around her head and in her lap as she extends a bouquet to the woman of the couple. See the winged figure of Cupid standing between Flora and her guests, bringing them together into a tableau of sociability, culture, and science. At the bottom of the page, we find a caption to the engraving that reads, Flora dispensing her favors. This is not language about a powerful figure of dominion, and nor is it language that invites Flora's guests into botanical knowledge and practices. Instead, the caption, Flora dispensing her favors, evokes the sexualized Flora of Roman springtime celebrations. And the image reads more like extending a promise of erotic pleasure to a couple on the brink of marriage, or perhaps just on the brink. Flora is in their service in this case. Now, a core argument of Beverly Seaton's book, The Language of Flowers, is that the language of flowers was, as I showed you, a cultural myth using nature to validate manners and morals. Her book unpacks this so very well. Beverly Seaton also remarks in passing that the figure of Flora as goddess can often be used to indicate important aspects of a period's attitude toward flowers and floral emblems. Flora also, I have found, can be used to indicate a period's attitudes toward women. I've discussed already various examples of this mythological figure as an active embodiment of nature in its floral aspects. What is striking to me is the gulf that I see between the power, energy, and dynamism found in those various older figures of Flora on the one hand, and the absence of that agency and dynamism in the lessons given to the women who are identified as the intended audience for language of flower books. That gap between power, energy, and dynamism and all the previous floras I've been showing you, and the absence of that in the language of flower books, in what is being offered to the women who are the intended audience for those books. Language of flower books are books of their time, illustrating and embodying cultural values of the 19th century associated especially with the Victorian age. Two final examples, one verbal and one visual, recap the flavor that I find in these books. Then, as I bring my presentation to its end, I would like to suggest something else coming into our time about languages of flowers that are hot topics at this moment, our moment, a time of a vegetative turn in writing about plants. Consider this book, The Artistic Language of Flowers, published in London in 1890. It's a visually lovely volume from the waning years of language of flower books. The book opens with a poem entitled Poetry of Flowers that celebrates the significance of flowers. It's a little hard to read the poem on the page, so let me just cite the second verse, which reads, in every clime, in every age, mankind have owned their pleasing sway, and lays to them have decked the page of moralist and minstrel gay. In this book, as in so many others of this type, we find a section on vocabulary with lists of plant names and emblematic meanings such as unchanging friendship, domestic virtue, and winning grace. We also find floral messages that are deciphered, such as your charms are engraven on my heart, and your purity equals your loveliness. One visual shown on the right-hand side of this slide is the cornflower, who is gendered female. I'll read the verse. There is a flower whose modest eye is turned with looks of light and love, who breathes her softest, sweetest sigh whene'er the sun is bright above. And now let's have a look at just a final example from this genre. This is a book entitled The Language of Flowers and Floral Conversation. It's published in Rochester, New York in 1875. This is an American publication. It must have connected with quite a readership because it came out in other editions as well across the 1870s and 80s and into the early 1890s. Again, as with others, it offers readers poems and lists of plants and flowers and their sentiments. It includes suggestions about how to put together floral bouquets to say something complex, such as, quote, "Your modesty and moral and intellectual worth inspire my love and devotion," quote unquote. At the end of this book, in the concluding page, we find the illustration on my slide. We see a woman, flowers in her hair, standing alone on a balcony that is itself enclosed by blossoms. She gazes downward, but does not seem to be making eye contact with anything or anyone. Is she a Juliet waiting for her lover? It looks like a Juliet kind of balcony. Is she a fairy tale figure of Rapunzel in a tower, captive or sequestered for her own protection? We have no poem to tell us why she is there and what she's doing. However, thinking about my backdrop of historical figures of Flora as the goddess of flowers, we can say what this woman is not. She's not a powerful queen. She's not a writer of a botanical flora with a pen in her hand, or even the author of an introductory botany book. She's not a dynamic young woman out among her flowers, and not even a demure figure reaching out through flowers to life-enhancing love. Instead, this late 19th century woman on a balcony stands apart, silent, rather energyless, as if inhabiting a Victorian separate sphere for womankind. She is an object of attention, and as I say, she is also silent. We do not hear her speak. In this regard, the woman on the balcony and the flowers and language of flowers books mirror one another. They are objects of attention and they are spoken about, but they do not get to speak for themselves. In this talk, I've been casting my eyes over a wide field of flowers. The flowers themselves as material objects and as objects of a literary and a scientific gaze. 19th century language of flower books from a particular time and place are intended for a specific audience of women readers at a time when women and flowers were closely intertwined, naturally linked in the minds of many, and when authors, editors, and publishers cultivated and reinforced these beliefs. Right now, we in the 21st century are in heady times for thinking about plants and flowers and for reflecting on how they are presented to lovers of nature. Our social and cultural consciousness has sharpened about peril and loss in the biome. Ecologists and environmental historians call us to attention about our human relationships to plants and with plants. The idea of conversation between and among plants has quite a bit of currency among people interested in plant communication, plant intelligence, and sentience. Thinkers and observers of various kinds have challenged long-held assumptions about plants, above all as a resource for humans, rather than integrating plant agency into how we approach plants. Are there new ways to understand and to represent plant life that go beyond an anthropocentric relationship to plants and flowers, and that could give voice to plants? A generation now is turning to plants and looking for new ways of thinking about human and non-human worlds and about other plant knowledges and other kinships. Who are we, after all, to speak for flowers? Consider the lily of the valley in one of the 19th century language of flower books. What would it say if it could speak to itself? Do we even ask? What might we learn if we listened, if we spoke in a reciprocal conversation? As the ethnobotanist author of a book about indigenous botanical teachings has put it, quote, plants have so much to give us. All we have to do is ask, quote. If this symposium reconvenes at a future time, might we have a collection of new style language of flower books to discuss? And might we have a new style figure of flora, an icon in a new style mythology with which to journey through floral worlds? I thank Leora Siegel and the Lenhart Library for the opportunity to reflect on language of flower books and the questions they raise for me. And I look forward now to hearing from the other symposium speakers. Thank you.
I'm delighted to present our next speaker. Brent Elliott was formerly librarian, then historian of the Royal Horticultural Society in London. He has written on the history of gardens, the history of botany, and the history of botanical art. Among his books are Victorian Gardens, published in 1986, The Royal Horticultural Society 1804 to 2004, published in 2004, RHS Chelsea Flower Show, published in 2013, and Federico Sessi's Botanical Manuscripts, the last named part of the publication of the Paper Museum of Cassiano del Pozo. He was the founder editor of occasional papers from the RHS Lindley Library. He has been a member of the Victorian Society's Building Committee for over 40 years, and he was a member of the English Heritage, Historic Parks, and Gardens Advisory Committee for 21. He is currently president of EBHL, the European Botanical and Horticultural Libraries Group. Welcome, Brent.
Good morning, or from where I'm sitting in England, good afternoon. My name is Brent Elliott. I'm now retired, but I was formerly the librarian of the Royal Horticultural Society. And in that library, we have numerous books about the language of flowers in the 19th century. So on the basis of that raw material, I'm going to speak for the next half hour or so about the problems, the confusions, the idiosyncrasies, and the idiocies of the language of flowers. Let me begin not quite at the beginning. In 1819, a book was published in Paris called Le Langage des Fleurs by Charlotte de la Tour. Here you can see the title page and frontispiece of the first edition. It's a rather water-stained copy, and this is a good point to remark that, unless otherwise stated, all the images that you will see in this presentation come from the Royal Horticultural Society's Lindley Library. Le Langage des Fleurs was illustrated by Pancrace Bessa, one of the more prominent botanical artists of the time, and there you can see an example of the quality of his work. It contained a series of essays on individual plants with some suggestions about their meaning. So first question, who was Charlotte de la Tour? The name was a pen name. She has been identified as Louise Cortambert, the mother of the once famous geographer Eugène Cortambert. There's her grave in the cemetery at Passy in the west of Paris. She was born in 1782, so she was in her late 30s when the book appeared. Now, in her introduction, she makes a claim that she is conveying to her audience a traditional mode of communication that has fallen out of use in modern Europe, but that remained extant in Turkey and was once widespread in various ways. She said, for us who live without constraint, you'll notice that the idea of being without constraint is rather different for a French woman in 1819 from what it would be today. Cleverness is a charm, a virtue, and not a dire necessity. The freedom of our manners has relegated it to the amusement of seraglios. The beautiful odalisques use it often to retaliate against the tyrant who outrages and scorns their charms. A simple spray of lily of the valley, dropped as if by chance, lets a young Ichoglan know that the favorite sultana, weary of a tyrannical love, wishes to inspire and partake of a lively and pure sentiment. And there you can see an illustration of how this communication is supposed to take place. The lady is handing a spray of flowers to an attractive young man, and this will convey a message. Where did this idea come from? Where did she get her notions about the Oriental use of sprays of flowers? Well, the answer is from Mary Wortley Montagu, who almost exactly a century before Latour's publication visited Turkey and described her experiences in letters to her friends. These letters were published posthumously in 1763. And this letter shows the method of communication that she described in use in the harem. This is not a language of flowers for two reasons. The first is that it is not a language. The different plants named in this do not have meanings attached to them. They are purely mnemonic devices for recalling lines of poetry by rhyme. For example, in Turkish, the word for a jonquil is pul. This rhymes with the line, derdime derman bul, which means, have pity on my passion. You can easily understand from this that it's not enough to have the plant or other object that recalls the line of poetry. There also has to be a means of making sure that the lines of poetry are recalled in the right order. Montagu refers to items being pulled out of a purse in sequence. So there's an element of positioning as well as simply the identity of the plants. The other reason it's not a language of flowers is that it's not merely flowers. As you can see from the text here, cloth, gold thread, etc., are also among the items described or used. She says, you see, this letter is all verses, and I can assure you there is as much fancy shown in the choice of them as in the most studied expressions of our letters, there being, I believe, 1 million of verses designed for this use. There is no color, no flower, no weed, no fruit, herb, pebble, or feather that has not a verse belonging to it. And you may quarrel, reproach, or send letters of passion, friendship, or civility, or even of news without ever inking your finger. So, not a language of flowers. A decade before Latour's publication, the German Orientalist Josef Hammer-Purgstall published an article about the alleged language of flowers, and he pointed out just how many different substances there were involved in it. Not just flowers and fruits, but brick, coffee, coins, coral, feathers, needles, slipper, skullcap, soap, and things like egg yolk and egg white, which must have been in their own containers within the purse. He also disputed Montagu's claims and the claims of others who had copied from her about the use of this system of communication on a widespread basis in Turkey. It was used only in the harem, he said. Nobody outside the harem knew about it. And it was not seriously used for making assignations with men. If it was anything more than simply a game, it was probably used to arrange lesbian assignations within the harem. Purgstall published his article in both German and French, but as it will be obvious from the rest of this lecture, he was not much attended to. The spread of the idea that there was an Oriental language of flowers, we really owe to these two men, Bernardin de Saint-Pierre and Walter Scott. Now, I'm sure all of you have heard of Walter Scott, even if you have not been fortunate enough to read him, but Bernardin de Saint-Pierre might not be a well-known name nowadays. And yet, his novel, Paul et Virginie, has been published in more editions and probably in more translations into other languages than any other novel in French history. This is a rather dismaying fact when you actually read the novel. It is set in Mauritius, Bernardin's favorite country. Virginie is a young, innocent, and modest young woman, and her modesty leads to her death. She is caught in a shipwreck, refuses to take off her clothes in order to swim safely from the wreck, and is drowned by the weight of her clothing. And nowhere in the novel does it suggest that it might have been a good idea for her to be less modest. The implication is that death is just one of those things that a woman has to take into account as part of her life. You can see I'm doing my best to bias you against him. However, the important work for the purposes of Language of Flowers is a little work called The Indian Cottage. And this contains a description of the courtship of an untouchable in India. He falls in love with a widow he sees tending her husband's grave, and he starts leaving out his own plants on it. Quote, "To obtain a hearing, I borrowed the language of flowers according to the custom of India by adding marigolds to my poppies. The night after, I perceived that my poppies and my marigolds had been watered. The night following, I became more venturous. I joined with the poppies and the marigolds a flower of the falsipath." And he moves on to a tulip and a rosebud, etc. First observation, the language of flowers has spread from the Islamic world to the Indian world. Second observation, what is the falsipath? Answer, it is a type of hibiscus, formerly thought of as a distinct species, which is endemic to Mauritius. So you can see that Bernardin was not being very careful about this alleged Indian language of flowers and not restricting himself to the local flora in India. Tulips might just be available in India, but marigolds? No, this is obviously a very imaginary language of flowers that the Untouchable is referring to. However, the work had an impact. And less than a decade before Latour's publication, a man named Delechenay published a book called the Abécédaire des Fleurs, ou Langage des Fleurs, in which he said, there was an episode in the Indian Cottage which makes us regret that this distinguished writer didn't undertake the creation of a complete system of such a desirable language. So Delechenay decided to repair the gap. Delechenay's Alphabet of Flora, or Language of Flowers, could be described as the first Language of Flowers book. Why then did I not begin my lecture with it? Firstly, because most of the book deals with the system of using plants to represent the letters of the alphabet. It's only at the end that we have an appendix listing plants with their meanings. There are 124 plants in this list. Also, Delechenay's book was never given a second edition. It was never translated. It was not well distributed. And of the number of meanings he suggested, only about 10% ever found their way into the works of Charlotte de Latour and subsequent writers. So a predecessor, but not a true Language of Flowers book. Now, the way was prepared in England for the adoption of Language of Flowers by Walter Scott. In his novel, The Fortunes of Nigel, Lady Hermione describes how she was imprisoned in Spain. In her attempts to communicate, quote, "I knew something of the symbolical language of flowers, once carried to such perfection among the Moriscos of Spain. One day, an old Moorish slave says to her, 'There is heart's ease near the postern.' So she makes her way to the postern and is reunited with her husband." Observation 1. What language were these Moorish slaves talking? English? Heartsease is an English name for Viola tricolor, but there is no corresponding name in Spanish or in Arabic. But there is no name for the plant in Arabic or Spanish that corresponds to it. And second observation, Scott has obviously read Montague and assumed that this language of flowers that she was describing flourished throughout the entire Arabic world and therefore made its way into Spain. Well, Scott was a figure of such influence in the 19th century that even his bungles became matters of cultural importance. And thanks to the fortunes of Nigel, the idea that there was a language of flowers used in that mysterious Orient to convey messages was there and available to be drawn on. Let us now return to Charlotte de la Tour and say a bit more concrete about her book. It contains essays on different plants, suggesting, among other things, meanings for them. And at the end of the book, there is an alphabetical index of meaning, not an alphabetical index of plants, although that was supplied in later editions. There are about 330 different meanings listed, and some of them are descriptions of mental states, like patience, coldness. Others are instructions or other sorts of message. Render me justice. Better to die than lose one's innocence. Latour's book was translated into many European languages, and all subsequent authors on the language of flowers either adopted her meanings to a greater or lesser extent, or specified that she was the source that they were reacting against in proposing other meanings. 6 years after Latour's work, an English adaptation by Henry Phillips, a well-known gardening writer, appeared, Floral Emblems. Of the nearly 300 definitions offered by Phillips, over a third were straightforward borrowings from Latour. Another number were less straightforward borrowings. Some were mistranslations. Latour gave défense, meaning prohibition, as the definition for privet. Phillips changed this to defense, and to justify it, he gave a horticultural reason. Privet was planted in garden hedges to protect tender plants. Latour gave folie, madness, as the meaning for columbine. Phillips rendered it as folly. In other cases, he adopted her meanings but transferred them to other plants, possibly by confusion over which plant was intended. Latour gave austerity as the meaning for thistle. Phillips transferred it to the teasel. Latour gave beauty always new as the meaning for the damask rose. Phillips transferred that to the China rose. He also resisted certain aspects of Latour's rhetoric. He thought that she was indelicate. Quote, the author has carefully avoided all indelicate allusions or double entendre that could be offensive to modesty. And so, aimabilité, meaning lovableness, as the meaning of jasmine, is rendered by Phillips as amiability, something rather more superficial. Rocket, for American rocket, for my American listeners, that's arugula. Latour defined as je brûle, I burn. Phillips devoted it to rivalry. Tuberoses, Latour defined as volupté, voluptuousness. In the English books, this gradually sank into dangerous pleasures. Latour defined heliotrope as enivrement, je vous aime, intoxication, I love you. Phillips rendered this as infatuation, and later writers made it dwindle further into devotion. Also, religious differences appeared. Latour had given croyance, meaning faith or belief, as the definition for passion flower. Phillips was having nothing of that. He gave the meaning as religious superstition. The earliest American language of flower book that I know of is by a man named H. Bourne, about whom I know nothing, not even his first name. Flores Poetici, the florist's manual, was published in Boston in 1833. Bourne announced that he was producing a set of meanings that related to existing literary traditions. The result was a lot of arbitrary coinages. He managed to have religious faith as a meaning, but it was not for the passion flower, it was for the Michaelmas daisy. Pride and elegance is the meaning of the auricula. Lobelia meant malevolent aspersion. Chrysanthemum meant flattery. The primrose was defined as meaning virtue in the shade. Trust a Bostonian to come up with that one. Not everybody in England was happy with Latour's meanings. A working class poet named Thomas Miller, nicknamed the Poetical Basket Weaver, published a poetical language of flowers in which he said he was defending the native English tradition of meanings over the French. Well, even Phillips had already decided that rosemary had to mean remembrance. And in fact, most of Miller's meanings came straight from Latour. However, he did add a few things of his own. Moss rosebud meant confession of love. Buttercup meant ingratitude. Apricot blossom meant doubt. Of all the oddities in the language of flowers tradition, the most delightful really is the Catholic language of flowers by the Young Ladies of Gumley House. This was published in 1861. It had a dedication to Nicholas Wiseman, who was the first Roman Catholic Cardinal of England in 300 years. The Young Ladies of Gumley House could not bring themselves to return passion flower to the full meaning of faith or belief. They just made it meditation. However, they did manage to apply religious meanings to many plants. Apples meant temptation. I wonder where they got that one from. White rose became holy death. Moss rose, holiness. The hyacinth, St. Joseph's early life. Veronica naturally became Saint Veronica. In earlier books, the meaning of the garden anemone had been given as forsaken. The Young Ladies made it Jesus forsaken. Arbor Vitae had stood for eternal friendship. They made it stand for desire for eternal life. Now, presumably, these convent girls did not give each other bouquets. They merely used the plants for contemplation. The next most influential writer was the American poet Lucy Hooper, who in 1841 published the Lady's Book of Flowers and Poetry, which included a floral dictionary. Within 3 years, it had been published in England as well, with a different title, and it was plagiarized and appeared in versions without an author's or editor's name applied. She introduced such concepts as the bay leaf, meaning I change in dying. Night blooming cereus, transient beauty. Peach blossom, I am your captive. We have now reached the middle of the century, and the language of flowers books are ceasing to be books of essays on plants and are becoming purely lists. Some plants have consistent meanings throughout the entire run of the language of flowers in the 19th century. Snapdragon always meant presumption. Yellow roses always meant infidelity. Hyacinths had more than one name, hyacinths had more than one meaning, but games or play was always one of them. Daisies always meant innocence. Other plants were not so lucky. We look at Crocus sativus. The variety of meanings attached to it in different books includes do not abuse, do not deceive yourselves, mirth or laughter, excess is dangerous, beware of excess. So the lesson here is that if you're going to send messages by the language of flowers, it's important to make sure that your correspondent was using the same book. In 1869, a new generation of language of flower books was inaugurated with John Ingram's Flora Symbolica, or the language and sentiment of flowers. This was the largest, most capacious volume of the language of flowers yet, in part because it tried to collect together all the meanings that Ingram could find in previous language of flower books. Despite the fact that some of these meanings contradicted each other, they were all there. In the wake of Ingram, this became the norm. Most of the language of flowers books that appeared subsequently were anonymous. They were obviously compiled by people whose expertise lay not in plants, but in arranging file cards. In 1869, a new generation of Language of Flowers books was inaugurated by John Ingram's Flora Symbolica, or The Language and Sentiment of Flowers. This new generation was characterized by books that were usually anonymous and whose compilers were obviously less skilled in plant lore than in the arrangement of file cards. Flora Symbolica was the largest and most comprehensive book on the language of flowers yet published, and part of the reason for that was that he included all the previous language of flowers meanings that he could find, even though a number of them were contradictory. In the wake of that, many language of flowers books were produced, and increasingly standards of ornament became apparent. The books were produced ever more beautifully, becoming, in some cases, actual gift books. These later comprehensive books present many contradictions internally. Plants sometimes appear under different names derived from English and American books. So, for example, trumpet flower, meaning fame, and bignonia, meaning separation. These are the same plant. Gorse, love for all seasons, and win, anger. These are the same plant. Virginia spiderwort, momentary happiness, is the same plant as Tradescantia, esteem, not love. Allspice, compassion, is the same as Calycanthus, benevolence. Chicory and endive are the same plant. They appear in different places alphabetically, but at least those two have the same meaning, frugality. Another reason why Ingram's book was so large was because he added many new plants. There had been a huge increase in the number of ornamental garden plants being grown in England and Europe since the days of Latour and Henry Phillips. So Ingram provided new meanings for some of these introductions, and sometimes you can see that he was filling unfortunate gaps in the variety of messages available. So Hebe became "Keep this for my sake." Lilium japonicum, "You cannot deceive me." Stephanotis, "Will you accompany me to the east?" Strangely enough, no English language of flowers book had "Will you accompany me to Gretna Green," which would have been more practical. Gretna Green being a town just over the border in Scotland, famous as a place where eloping couples could go to get married. There are also many bungles and errors. There was a plant once called Malva creana. It's now a Sphaerosia. Ingram obviously couldn't read his handwriting when he came to have the book set up in print. And it was printed as Malon creana. And thereafter, book after book on the language of flowers lists Malon creana. None of the compilers of these books ever thought to ask, is this a correct plant name? Again, Germander Speedwell, the original meaning was fidelity. Ingram got his spelling wrong again, and it became facility. And as facility, it spread through later language of flowers books. Here's another concrete example. The turnip. And if you thought that language of flowers applied mainly to bouquets and corsages, just ask yourself how you would incorporate a turnip or even a piece of turnip in your corsage. But the meaning given to turnip was charity. The meaning of tulip was always pretty straightforwardly declaration of love. Then in the 1880s, you begin to get language of flower books which give charity as a meaning for tulip, pretty obviously as a result of somebody trying to read scrawled handwriting on a card. In these later language of flower books, the range of plants increased to include things that we might find rather surprising. Pumpkin and watermelon. Again, not things readily incorporated within a bouquet. And the meaning given for both of them is bulk. Presumably, this is a warning against fat people. Mushrooms, cacti, uncomfortable in a corsage, and most amusingly of all, nostoc. Here it is quite easy to imagine how it might be applied. It means resistance or opposition, so you just grab up a handful of nostoc and splatter it over the bouquet that somebody has offered you. Every young woman should have a tub full of nostoc in her bedroom. Also, the range of meanings expands to include things whose relevance is not now obvious. The witching power of music, the color of my fate, fairies' fire, bury me amid nature's beauties. Under what circumstances would anybody have found it necessary to send that as a message? Well, by the 1880s, a set of rules for the management of the language of flowers was in circulation. You can contradict the meaning of a flower by giving it reversed. If you take a rosebud and remove all the thorns but retain the leaves, it means I fear no longer, I hope, etc., etc. The language of flowers is starting to seem like a parlor game. And behold, there was a language of flowers parlor game. This one, Das Reich der Blumenköniginnen, was available at least as early as 1865. It is a build your own bouquet through slotting in scraps. The text appears in 3 languages, German, French, and English English was very definitely not the first language of the compilers. Example, this little poem that appears at one point. Thou wouldst know others? To attain the art, thou needest only study own heart. Well, by the end of the 19th century, the flow from publishers of language of flower books was dwindling to a trickle. But a new medium appeared to give extra life to the language of flowers. That was the picture postcard. Greetings cards with floral messages derived from the language of flowers proliferated during the Edwardian period. But after the First World War, even these gradually dissipated, and the language of flowers looked as though it was going to be forgotten. In 1935, a writer in the Gardener's Chronicle remarked of language of flower books, how antique in spirit they seem, how remote from the thought of the present age, far more so than many a book which is 3 times as old. However, you can't keep a bad idea down, and in the 1960s, the language of flowers began to return. The 1960s saw the first wave of a revival of interest in things Victorian, that first wave being devoted primarily to Victoriana, not Victorian architecture or philosophy, but things that could be treated as amusing, as camp, etc. Some of the old language of flower books were reprinted in facsimile in the 1960s, and during the 1970s, new books on the language of flowers began to appear. And so today, the language of flowers is back with us. This is the Duchess of Cambridge's wedding bouquet, designed by the flower arranger Shane Connolly, who had published a book on the language of flowers. The meanings given for the flowers are ones that would have been found in most 19th century books. And so it is still around, and it has now found another medium, the website, to which it can be propagated. If you are of a mind to investigate this sort of thing, all you have to do is tap into your computer. At that point, we are leaving behind the print technology with which I am familiar, so I will bring this lecture to a close. Thank you.
I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Stacy Stolt. She is the Library Public Services Manager and Rare Book Specialist at the Chicago Botanic Gardens Lenhart Library. She holds a master's degree in library science with a focus on the history of the book. She studied bookbinding, illustration processes, and researching rare book resources at the University of Virginia's Rare Book School. Stacy presents programs at the Lenhart Library, including Meet the Rare Books, which provides interpretation and introduces rare books and primary sources to students, researchers, the curious, and the general public. Stacy serves as chair of 2 committees for the Council on Botanical and Horticultural Libraries, the leading professional organization in the field of botanical and horticultural information. Welcome, Stacy.
Hi, I'm Stacy Stolt, Rare Book Specialist at the Lenhart Library of the Chicago Botanic Garden. It's an honor to be included in today's Language of Flowers Symposium. You've heard some scholarly presentations given by Brent and Rusty, so it's my pleasure to present the fun part, Volumes on View. But before I do, I'd like to thank Leora Siegel of the Lenhart Library, Jackie and Zarko of the Caxton Club for making this possible, and share with you something I found serendipitously whilst working on this presentation. 2 cups. I was looking for teacups at my Aunt Loretta's, who recently passed away, and lo and behold, I found these 2 cups. Of all the years of visits and coffees and teas, I didn't remember ever seeing these, and how ironic, I thought. Leora pointed out that my aunt was still helping me. On one cup, it reads, "The red geranium symbolizes true friendship. The other, the pink rose, is a symbol of love." So I'd like to start out with this little lovely volume called The Language of Poetry and Flowers, published by Anonymous in New York in 1867. Focusing here on pansies or viola tricolor, it's always been known as heart's ease. Of course, Ophelia in Hamlet says, "And there is pansies, that's for thoughts." Shakespeare refers to the pansy as love and idleness in Midsummer Night's Dream, where the mischievous sprite, Puck, puts drops of magical plant called love and idleness into the eyes of the sleeping characters, so that when they arise, they'll fall in love with the first person they see. Take all the sweetness of a gift unsought, and for the pansies, send me back a thought. Louis-Aimé Matin was a very prolific writer and the librarian at the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris. This is the New Language of Flowers from 1832. That's the pink cover and the title page. This is taken from the same book, The Beauty of the Day and the Beauty of the Night. Because these Language of Flower books were so popular, a well-known author like Matin could attract some of the best artists of that time. You can see the fine detail in his hand-colored stipple engraving created by Pancras Bessa, a pupil and colleague of Pierre-Joseph Redoute. Redoute and Bessa were considered the best botanical illustrators of their time. It also includes infidelity, coquetry or vanity, dreaded love, and timidity. Martin arranged his guide seasonally, interspersed in each volume with over a dozen delicate and stunning illustrative examples. At the end of the text, there are several dictionaries providing indices to details elsewhere in the volume. Here is his beautiful hortensia, hydrangea. Hydrangea macrophylla is what it's called, and it symbolizes extravagance. So the Language of Flower books in our collection span the time of the genre's popularity, and our earliest is from 1810, and they run through the early 1900s. The paper used during this era was made cheaply and quickly, directly from trees, resulting in acidity from the lignin in the trees, which can leave them brittle. You'll notice that some of the pages in these volumes show foxing and discoloration, even though they've been conserved. Here we see La Voilette, which means modesty, a violet in the youth of primary nature forward, not permanent, sweet, not lasting, the perfume and suppliance of a minute more. That's from Hamlet. All right, and here we are with tulip or tulipa, and tulips are better than one. I couldn't help myself. I've been saying them since I was young. Okay, but tulips vary in meaning and they're color dependent. Red tulip is a declaration of love. Variegated tulip means beautiful eyes. Yellow tulip is hopeless love. And tulip mania is known for causing one of the first recorded economic bubbles in the Netherlands in 1636 to 37. Okay, this is Thomas Miller's Poetical Language of Flowers from 1861. And that's the color and the title page. And in the crowded market of Language of Flower books, Thomas Miller differentiated his work in his preface by writing, "In the legends which illustrate each sentiment of groups of flowers, I have endeavored to create a new interest by linking them with human affections and fanciful narratives." And here's one of his just most beautiful illustrations in the book. Love, forget me not, for if forsaken, I die. So love is represented by myrtle, and myrtle is known as myrtus, and forget me not is myosotis, and forsaken is the anemone, and I die if neglected is the rustinus or viburnum. So I think that's just a lovely, lovely illustration. This one is, in solitude and silence, you occupy my thoughts, such as my devoted attachment. So solitude is represented by heath, silence by a white rose, thoughts by pansies, and devoted attachment is a heliotrope. And this one is kind of funny too. Your innocence and sincerity would make retirement happy. I think anything would make retirement happy, but innocence is represented by daisy. The sincerity is represented by a fern. Happy retirement is represented by harebell, and confident love by fuchsia. All right, this is one of my favorites. This is Henslow, Le Bouquet de Souvenirs. So Reverend John Stevens Henslow is not only the esteemed professor of botany at Cambridge University, but he's the John Stevens Henslow who encouraged Charles Darwin to take that life-changing 5-year, gut-wrenching, fantastical evolutionary boat ride on the HMS Beagle. So when I first saw this book, I thought, no, that can't be Henslow, not that Henslow, but of course it is. And I thought, why on earth is he writing a Language of Flowers book? And then I realized it was an undertaking by prolific Language of Flowers author Robert Tyus, but Henslow wrote the botanical descriptions. Very clever marketing. So here we have the moss rose, or Rosa centifolia, or Confession of Love. And it's also thought of as voluptuousness. So I thought that was pretty good. And here's harebell again, Campanula rotundifolia. That was the thing that meant happy retirement. Or Scottish bluebell for love everlasting. So the yew, or the taxus tree, has long been an emblem of sorrow, sometimes even death. Plants are said to die under its shade, and if the weary traveler should lie beneath its branches, he would become violently ill. The yew tree is considered a fit resident in cemeteries to shade the tomb. The strawberry tree, Arbutus unado, esteem and love, is an evergreen shrub native to the Mediterranean region and parts of France and Ireland. I read that the edible fruits taste like cherries, but have a hard underside or outside. Here's the geranium, or pelargonium. According to my Aunt Loretta's cup, the red geranium symbolized true friendship. And of course, the forget-me-not, Myosotis palustris, means just that, forget-me-not. Robert Tyus was the mastermind of the previous work with John Stevens Henslow, and he wrote prolifically on the Language of Flowers. Here are two covers of the Sentiment of Flowers, or the Language of Flowers. The first being from 1841 and the second from 1849. He explains in the introduction, it'll suffice that 2 or 3 rules be given, which the reader will do well first to learn. Then he'll be able to converse in the language of flowers. So the first rule, a flower presented inclining to the right expresses a thought. Reversed, it's understood to convey the contrary of that sentiment. For example, a rosebud with its thorn and leaves is understood to say, I fear, but I hope. The same rosebud reversed would signify that you must neither fear nor hope. You may convey your sentiments very well by a single flower. As a second rule, take the rosebud and strip it of its thorns, and it tells you that there's everything to hope for. Strip it of its leaves, and it'll express that there's everything to fear. And here we have Robert Tyus's Crown Imperial. It's also known as the Fritillaria imperialis. And here's a poem about it. It's the lily's height bespoke command, a fair imperial flower. She seemed designed for Flora's hand, the scepter of her power. We have therefore elevated distinguished member of Flora's kingdom to be the emblem of majesty and the representative of power and our floral sentiments. I adore this cover. Even though the language of flowers is very Victorian, there's something almost medieval about this cover. This is our 1858 copy of Henrietta Dumont's Floral Offering. And although Dumont has a very extensive dictionary within these covers, I chose to show the lovely illustrations instead. So here she is saying, I confess your majestic beauty has awakened my first emotions of love. And that's represented by a rosebud, a yellow lily, and a lilac. But this one really took me off guard. She said, your self-love and stupidity evade my pity. And I thought in today's society, it might not be good to show this one, but well, you know, it's from 1858. So what are you going to say? Narcissus is self-love. Scarlet geranium means stupidity. Not the pink geranium of my aunt's cup. So not that friendship. And the marigold signifies grief. Okay, this one's the artistic language of flowers. And it was written by an anonymous person. It's got a beautiful cover and title page. Now, Henrietta Dumont, the woman that we saw, or the books of the woman that we saw before, had an extensive floral lexicon included in that book of the Floral Offering. But this vocabulary included in the artistic language of flowers by anonymous is not only comprehensive, but beauteous as well. So the apple blossom or pyrus, which is shown here, signifies preference. And the rose beauty represents love. More rapturously sings of the rose, rose thereout the sweetest flower, and that ever drank the amber shower. Rose that are the fondest child of dimpled spring, the wood nymph wild. And here's more of the vocabulary. So next to the floriated vocabulary page, we have a pink or dianthus for pure love, and a bluebell, the convolvulus or Calistigia soldanella. Say that a few times. And Margaret Daisy Bellis perennis for innocence. And then of course we have this beautiful sunflower or helianthus in the center. So a tall sunflower is known as haughtiness, where a dwarf sunflower is for adoration. The left-hand corner, there's a tulip, and we all know about the joke about tulips are better than one. The lower left is the wild apple blossom. So we've seen that one before. The lower right is the forget-me-not or the myosotis. But up in the right-hand corner, there's a cyclamen persicum. And we haven't seen that one yet. That one signifies diffidence or modest or shy because of a lack of self-confidence. Okay, this one's one of my favorite covers. This photo does not do it justice. The title is a hoot too. Language and Poetry of Flowers, Poetic Handbook, Wedding Anniversary Pieces, Album Verses, and Valentines, together with a great number of beautiful poetical quotations from famous authors. And that's quite a title. And there's the spine. So it's got this really awesome gold tooling, and you can kind of see it in there. It's just gorgeous. So whenever anybody wants to see one of our, beautiful language of flowers, the inside's not so great, but the outside is exquisite. Okay, so here we've got Henry Phillips, who wrote the Floral Emblems, or a Guide to the Language of Flowers, from 1825. And this I thought was nice. Someone finally pays homage to the painters and the poets that do all the work inside these wonderful, wonderful books. So very euphuistically, he writes, whose work have so eminently contributed to raise the fame of the kingdoms above the level of that of any other nation in modern times. The author most respectfully presumes to dedicate this collection of floral emblems as a humble acknowledgement of the great delight their performances have afforded him from the earliest period of his memory to the time he has the honor of subscribing himself. Their most devoted admirer and humble servant, Henry Phillips, Brighton, May 28, 1825. Really laying it on thick, but at least he acknowledges the poets and the artists. Okay, so the first illustration here, this is from Phillips' emblems, signifies a declaration of love with a variegated tulip. No, not tulips again, from humility to amiability. And just to give you an idea, there were 18 hand-colored engravings in this book, and it provides examples of complicated floral messages, such as delicate and lasting pleasures arising from the cup of innocence. So there you have it. The first illustration in this slide reads youth and beauty united by the bonds of love. And the second illustration signifies emblematical leaves for each day of the week. I encourage you to read the treatise on the daily leaves. It was a bit too involved for this presentation, but it's pretty cool. Okay, and lastly, so Phillips also wrote about when a lady sends a congratulatory message or a ceremonious invitation, it's generously accompanied with some emblematic flowers carefully wrapped in an embroidered handkerchief. The freshness of the flowers show the speed of the messenger, whilst the selection speaks in silent language, the sentiments of the party from whom they are sent, and whose rank is also distinguished by the costliness or beauty of the embroidered envelope. Apparently, these bouquets were sent to someone quite worthy. Hey, so now we've got Rebecca Hay. So she was born Rebecca Roberts, English poet and artist, published her first book, The Moral of Flowers, and it went on to be published in 1835 and 1849. The book is an encyclopedia of English flowers in which each article is preceded by a 4-color engraving of the flower created by William Clark. So another shout out to the artist. So yay, Rebecca Hay. Clark was a former draftsman and engraver for the Horticultural Society of London, which is now known as the Royal Horticultural Society. So here we see the wood anemone, or Anemone nemorosa, meaning forsaken. And I always have a hard time saying bush vetch. It's really hard for me to say. It's Vicia sepium, symbolizes I cling to thee, or shyness. And cowslip is primula veris, meaning pensiveness or winning grace. You can just see how lovely those colors are. And here we have the almond blossom. This is Rebecca Hay as well. Amygdala communis is its Latin name. It's native to Syria, but naturalized in Southern Europe. And because it's the moral of flowers, she wrote that the rod of the almond tree was given to Jeremiah to represent the tribes of Israel, emblematic of the vigilance required of their duties. This one is rosemary, Rosmarinus officinalis, and the violet. So we've heard about violet before. And of course, you know, again with Ophelia and Hamlet, there's rosemary, that's for remembrance, pray love, and there is pansies, that's for thoughts. So Rebecca Hay extracts much of her interpretations from a variety of poets. For example, she writes in this book, the violet was considered an emblem of constancy, probably from its blossoms being generally blue, which was esteemed an unchanging color in nature. Violet is for faithfulness, which in me shall abide, hoping likewise that from your heart you will not let slide. Then she's got the primrose and dog rose. So the primrose is the Primula vulgaris, and Hay quotes William Wordsworth's poem To the Small Celandine. Long as there's a sun to set, primroses will have their glory. After reviewing other poetic attributes, Hay writes that the primrose is a fit emblem of modesty and humility. Another meaning is early youth. Another name is first rose. Even though it's not a rose, it's an early sign of spring. Prime Minister Disraeli loved primroses so much, and Queen Victoria sent him bunches from her garden. When he died, she honored him with a large wreath of primroses as a token of her respect. Then we have the dog rose, Cornus florida, means love undiminished by adversity, and love does reign. These are other beautiful ones, pimpernel and nightshade. The pimpernel is called Anagallis arvanensis, and the nightshade is from the Solanaceae family. And we have the Michaelmas daisy and the passion flower. The daisy stands for innocence, but the Michaelmas daisy, it's called Aster amelis, symbolizes an afterthought. The passion flower, or passiflora, signifies faith. We have speedwell and honeysuckle. Speedwell is also known as Veronica officinalis, and it means the only true remedy. The honeysuckle, Lonicera, vision of happiness. Okay, so we're going to break away a little bit from Rebecca Hay and take a look at this Language of Flowers by Ernest Nister in 1890. This interesting little book depicted children in place of flowers. So to have a little fun, I created a Hay-Nister mashup that includes Rebecca Hay botanical illustrations on the right next to Nister's kids. So there we have, so on the right, that's referred to in Rebecca Hay's book as harebell and grass. And harebell on the right is the girl playing the violin. And when I saw anything about grass and harebell, I just thought it was something that my cats brought over to me. Okay, this is also the Hay-Nister mashup, crocus and snowdrop. I don't know if you can see the words where the children are, but it does say crocus and snowdrop. And then of course the beautiful illustration on the right is a crocus and snowdrop. And then lastly, this is the lily of the valley. So we've got lily on the left and a lily valley of the right, on the right. I thought that was kind of fun. Then we have Cupid's basket, language and poetry of flowers. You notice that almost every one of these books is called The Language of Flowers, and they're all by anonymous. So that's kind of interesting. And again, this is another anonymous Language of Flowers books. It features the crocus, though, which is here equated with cheerfulness, and also according to Henrietta Dumont, youth. Crocus sativus is the saffron crocus, and the saffron is one of the most expensive spices in the world. Oh, and I love this. This is an exquisite illustration from Florencio's Jasmine, Language of Flowers and Fruit. It's one of the few Language of Flower books that we have written in the Spanish language. And we've got pansies, bluebells, and rose. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. This one I love, The Language and Poetry of Flowers and the Art of Flirtation from 1884. So part of this Magnet handbook series was number 32, published in New York and sold for 25 cents. And I looked through it and it had everything from hat and handkerchief flirtations to a model love letter to the art of kissing deliciously. And the page on the right says, it's called The Lover's Library. So being a librarian, I thought I might have to check this out on another date. Okay, Cupid's Almanac, and this is a lot of fun too. It's Cupid's Almanac and Guide to Horticulture. So it was compiled for D. Cupid by Oliver Hereford and Cecil Clay. And on the right-hand side, you see these funny little people in the plants, and this one's called April Fulia Jiltia midifolia. She's in the skidoo family. Some of the failures with this plant are heartbreaking, it says. And here we have another couple. the Valentine flower, Lovelornia desperadia, Epistolaria family, blooms only one day in the year, but if the blossoms are tenderly kept, they will retain their sweetness for a long time. And the one on the right is called the puff blossom, Powdermanosia delicata, Frivalia family, shy, blooms out of the way corners and on dressing tables. And lastly, the guide to horticulture. That's a crocus, I guess, on the right. It says on the left, it says Newflamia requires a good deal of attention, but is usually a very satisfactory plant to cultivate. And next to that is the rubber plant, Snoopia vulgaris, Ibulgia or Ibulgia family, grows wild if planted near a window. Oh boy. So here's one of our past exhibitions at the Lenhart Library. It was a Language of Flowers, Floral Art and Poetry from 2016. So I just thought I'd include this to, we've done quite a few Language of Flowers installations. There was one in 2008 or 2009. So this is the case one, and here's case two. And there's case three. And I just thought I would include this because it's just really beautiful. And one last thing before I wrap it up. If we've learned anything from this symposium, it's that the Language of Flowers is fun and gimmicky and whimsical, and that the definitions definitely vary by author. There's the yellow rose or rosa. It means the decrease of love, jealousy, infidelity, friendship. So I wrote my own little verse, and I thought, well, they're all different, but maybe we could look for a universe. So unlike the language of music, the language of flowers is not precise. A yellow rose, one can suppose, differs in meaning when looked up twice. Well, thanks for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed it. And this is Stacy signing off.
All right, here we are, live. Thank you all for sticking with us. We had so many technical challenges to get to here, but this is fun. So I'm seeing us all in gallery view. Is that how our audience is seeing us? So we can just have a cool interaction? Yeah, okay. So Rusty, you had a question. Why don't you throw it out again?
Okay. Just listening to the three of you who have a broad overview from earlier this century to later on, it made me wonder whether there was a change in the kind of flowers that were portrayed from the earlier books into the later books. That's my question. Can you read it for horticultural history?
To an extent, from the 1860s on, there's a great increase in the number of plants introduced into the Language of Flowers books. And many of these are introductions from the second quarter of the 19th century. When the first Language of Flowers books appeared, there were no fuchsias, there were very few verbenas, very few calceolarias, etc. These start appearing with profusion later. I can't think of any plants that get dropped from the early versions to the later ones.
So fuchsias were among the newer introductions. What were some others?
Plenty of glasshouse plants, Stephanotis, cobia. Mine is going blank at the moment, sorry, but there are a number of greenhouse plants introduced.
Right.
And of plants used in flower beds, salvias, petunias, etc.
Ah, okay, great, thank you.
Very interesting. So, Rusty, or Anne, sorry, what brought you to working with women and plants? And thank you for your fascinating talk. That was awesome.
Yeah, just from when I was doing my PhD work, I got really interested in plant metaphors historically, and the switch over time and sort of development of science culture from 17th century onward, from the more mechanically oriented, mechanistic kind of clockwork imagery into the more organic imagery that we associate with Romanticism, and that fed into the evolutionary ideas that Erasmus Darwin played with, and then Charles Darwin later on. The notion of processes of development and change. So the development, the unfolding, the budding, the blooming, the cultivation, those sorts of types of languages that then were applied to education. So we think of childhood education and pedagogy, it's all on those kind of metaphors. And it's the sort of thing that Rousseau would pick up on, and then later ones as well. The notion of the blooming girl is, there's a couple of wonderful scholars who have played with that notion of bloom in understanding what's going on in literature and the depiction of young people. So it's that, it really did capture me, because there's so much connection there between women and what is natural, women in nature and women is what is natural. And that is both opening up possibilities for women, but it also is channeling the kind of work, the kind of activities. So we think about the natural is associated more with the body, and then the intellect associated more with the mind. And that in turn can start to shape the kind of choices that get made about which activities women can be involved in. So mine leads through history out into larger cultural matters.
Very interesting. And any other questions on that subject between us? No? All right. We'll come back around. And Brent, a question for you. Where can we find a comprehensive list of the meanings of the flowers from the books? Language flower.
Well, here's a chance for me to advertise myself. About 10 years ago, I produced this occasional paper for the RHS Lindley Library on the language of flowers. And this has a 40-page section in the middle giving a directory of the flowers and their meanings. And this, you'll be delighted to know, is available online. So I'm not going to read you out a link, but just tap into your computer, RHS Library, Occasional Papers 10, and you can find the entire document on your screen.
Great, thanks. And I think I have our library copy checked out right now.
Can I add to that too? Yeah, Leora has that checked out, and that's what I was using in the beginning of my. So I'm like, Leora, you've got Brent's copy. So Brent's book, but I did use Henrietta Dumont's book. She seemed to have like a ready-made, you know, she had the lexicon, she had the indices and just everything. She was kind of an all-stop shop, but I would still prefer to use Brent's book.
So flattery will get you anywhere.
Stacy, what's your favorite book of all the Language of Flowers?
Well, I was thinking you were going to ask me that question, and you know, we saw that John Hereford book, or Hereford, that was the horticulture that Rusty had asked me about, and that is one of my favorites. There were so many. The Henslow book I thought was amazing, and the Thomas Miller book I love because of the illustrations, but Hereford was just so prolific, and he did a lot of children's books, but he also did another Language of Flowers book that we have in our collection. I think that one is called something Overheard in a Garden, where there are little kind of children florals. They're all whispering to each other. But he was, can I just talk a little bit about him? He was
Yes, is he British? Were they British?
Well, he was born in Somerset, but then his family moved to Chicago. So I thought that was kind of fun that, you know, we have a, yay, Chicago. He then moved to Boston and then went to art school in London, went to art school in Paris, and then ended up in New York. So he, you know, really traveled extensively, but he has put out so many books. I I didn't realize how many things, and all natural history, mostly children's books. But he even did a biography on Henry James. So really kind of different, but yeah, so that one really was a lot of fun because of the crazy plants, the Newflania and the, so.
But Stacy, is it a book that's available?
So I did look, it came out in 1908. There are only about 81 copies that I've seen, but I did see one for sale. So you can look one up online. There are, I don't think it's in copyright anymore though.
Is it in BHL?
It is not in BHL.
Okay,
That should be added to BHL.
put that on a list.
Leora made a note. She said, we're going to add that to BHL.
All right. And Brent, back to you. Are there any Victorian novels that have language of flowers in them, so written in the day, that you're aware of?
If the language of flowers was as much of a cult as we are led to believe, then you'd expect to find novels in which it plays a part. And if anybody out there knows of any, please let me know, because I haven't come across one yet. 10 years ago, there was a novel published called Language of Flowers by Valerie Diffenhall,
Right.
but that's a long way from the Victorian period itself. The closest connection that I can think of between Victorian fiction and the Language of Flowers is the fact that when she was a teenager, the young George Eliot was nicknamed Clematis, because in the Language of Flowers, Clematis means mental beauty, and she lacked the physical sort.
So to ask, I want to ask for everyone's opinion. So was the language of flowers an actual practice? What do you think? We know it's in books, but was it a real thing? So Brent, you're leaning towards.
I'm leaning towards it was probably conceived of as a game and no such great importance attached to it that would make it a feature of a plot feature in novels, and that it's as a game probably for adolescents and young people. Yes, I can well imagine that it carried on through much of the century, but whether it had any greater importance than that, I incline to doubt. But anybody who can find the evidence might prove me wrong.
Rusty, your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm really not a Victorianist on this, but what I would say is that the instructions in some of the books for making the bouquets is certainly specific enough. So why would it not have been put into practice? By whom it's put in practice is another matter, and you know how seriously they take it is another matter as well. But I mean, it's real, you know, it's not just the hokey kind of love messages that are getting sent, but later on, some of the books say, you know, for Thanksgiving, you want to do this, for Christmas, you want to do this. And so that's no different from, you know, what's in Kate's wedding bouquet. And it's a same kind of, my daughter went to a feminist girls' school and they were always doing language of flower bouquets for the girls at the end of term. So, and one of the books I noticed was given as from your collection was given as a prize gift at the end of a school year, for example. So you know they would have some purpose. Whether how seriously people took it was I suppose a different matter. You want diaries or Brent's, you know, could you find novels or better still memoirs. You know, that might give that information.
Mm-hmm.
Stacey, thoughts on that?
You know, as a romantic, I like to think that this was carried out amongst, you know, amongst people and probably young people, but I think it's a really good marketing. You know, we were talking about taking a look at our florists books from, you know, the early 1900s, and I have a feeling that, you know, commercially it's been really used, just like Rusty said, for weddings and different holidays and things like that. But if there was a time where I used to get flowers all the time from These
Both
hot
ingredients.
hit people. Not so much in the last decade, but yeah. So I think that it has relevance.
Could I add something, Laura? That is, like Stacy, I just adore the Language of Poetry and Flowers with the Art of Flirtation book from 1884. That's, if you ask me what my favorite book was, all the ones that for this I had an opportunity to look at, I would say it was that, because it's got all the elements, and then it adds fans, flowers, tipping her hat, handkerchiefs, all of that, and it's codes. And when I got to that in 1884, after starting earlier on, suddenly I realized this is all about codes. And for people who cannot speak directly, who have to go sideways with their messages, well, as they would do in the 18th century, as they would have done with patches on their faces. So in the 19th century, they would do with messages from inside a house to someone outside the window, or to, whatever forms of codes you want. They are all codes, and you can, play with them as seriously or as comically or as offhandedly as you might choose.
Brent, did you have a favorite book? Language of Flower book?
I think probably Henry Phillips' Floral Emblems.
Mm-hmm. Because of the comprehensiveness and the aspect of it?
It's not comprehensive. It's the beginning of the English tradition on such matters.
And putting the previous years together.
But possibly because more than any other writer on the Language of Flowers, he gives horticultural reasons for the explanation of the meanings.
And so I would like to, at some point in the future, dig into like the florist magazine. So we have a lot of historic journals in our collection. So we purchased a rare book collection, and we got us 2,000 historic journal runs, 2,000 titles of journals of these late 1880s to 1920s and 30s journals. They're not all beautiful. They're not all rare. They're historic, and they have some really cool things. So many of them are brittle, crumbling paper. They're not in the they're not in BHL. They're not digitized in the for-profit world of digitized journals. So there could be some really cool things to dig in. So I might in my spare time, which is I might dig in and see if we can find some Language of Flowers in florist journals from the 1880s and 1890s, 1910s. See what turns up.
Leora, do you have have you made up finding lists for a selection of those journals even?
Well, they're in our online catalog. They're cataloged, but the specifics of what's in each journal article and each issue are not. They're not in the databases. And we have a handwritten card catalog from the 1800s in library script, which is actually a little bit hard to read. Mostly it focuses on scientific names of plants, but I haven't looked at that in a long time. We can dig into that. One day that has to be digitized also with a machine. But yeah, some cool things still to discover on this topic.
Written by Mrs. Manx. She was the librarian and Miss Manx at the Massachusetts Horticultural Society.
Yes, where we got our rare book collection from in 2002, so relatively recently. So we, anything else between us in our panel discussion? We've been at this all morning, but I see we have 36 questions and coming in. So I know we want to get to answer some of those, but any other questions for us between us?
I make one observation stroke question.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that we've all been discussing English, American, and French publications, but the Language of Flowers spread into other European languages as well. About a quarter of a century ago, I regretfully was unable to buy a lot of somewhere between 40 and 60 Italian Language of Flowers books that were being offered by a dealer, but they were just way outside our budget. But I have never actually looked at an Italian Language of Flowers book. To what extent is their tradition different? and to what extent the same. And from the fact that that parlor game, as I showed you, was all had German text primarily, there's obviously a German language of flowers tradition, again, about which I know nothing. So I'd like to see some scholars look at the other European languages and their respective languages of flowers.
That's a great thought. So if we can get some other languages identified in collections and digitized, that would be wonderful. Yeah.
Could I introduce just one quick thought from the far end of a spectrum here? So there are hundreds of language of flower books that you all are introducing us to, but I wonder about whether there are other ones that we could not just discover, but that we could imagine or that we could invite. I mean, how about if we expand the vocabularies and play with the different possibilities? So I was focusing on, from my own particular angle, about a Victorian womanhood kind of audience, assuming that the audience, as we're learning, is principally for women of a certain class and certain orientation. But what about other audiences of women at the time? Like, what would a suffragist language of flowers look like, for example? And thinking also that these days we're into a new crop of gender swapped fairy tales. Well, what would a gender swapped language of flowers look like? Written, if not by men for women, by women for men, and specifically for men. And what about, LGBTQI language, different traditions that would take some of these ideas and maybe dispense with them or flip them or bring in others, since we know it wasn't just gender scripted qualities, but so many others, as Brent points out, so many in his list. What about those? What would other books look like that would bring together about individuals with the values of the day and with individuals? So that's my thought.
Well, at the end of my paper on language of flowers, I suggested that we could have an up-to-date one.
Right.
And a dried white rose, instead of meaning death is preferable to dishonor, might mean don't put that photo on Facebook and the like.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
I like that.
Yeah, that would be new crop of books for yeah, that would be something. I hope someone out there is listening and we'll come up with something. Wonderful. All right. Let's switch focus and let's see what's in the question and answers. So I do want to apologize when we lost our Zoom link earlier in the symposium. All of the questions that were there disappeared as well. So if you had a question early on before you logged in again and you want to add it again, we'll see. But we don't have too much time. But let's see what we've got there. All right. Okay. I'll read out loud and then we'll answer them out loud. So do you think that the later version of flora as wane and wilting is a result of the rise of the industry, pollution, and less agricultural focus? Rusty, do you want to try that one? It's the...
That was in response to her, the last page that she had for, Rusty, do you know?
Oh, my silent woman on the balcony.
Yes,
Right,
yeah.
right.
I took a photo of her in case we didn't remember what it was.
Oh, I remember. Yes, there it is. Is yours clearer than mine? Yes, yeah. Isn't it interesting? This is the thing about figures like this. We can come at them and try to figure out what they mean and the representation of them. Why is she so energyless? Indeed, it's almost any message from the later part of the century would be possible and applicable, but she certainly seems a bit spineless and she looks a bit dejected. I would say. Well, what do you think, Stacy, from your end, from the popular culture end?
Well, I think that we can look at it from, the pandemic right now and see that she's just solitary, looking out like, when am I going to get back to, seeing everyone again? But I do. I think that she does look like she's been dejected or something. And it makes me feel a little sad when I look at her. So I almost think about, my mom and my gram, they were divorced and they were single women, and they were kind of like singing the song, "It Must Be Him." So maybe that's where she's from.
It did make me wonder if at least we should be grateful that she has the language of flowers. If the only way she can speak from up on that balcony is through language of flowers, well, better to get her voice to that than nothing.
Definitely deserves a voice.
Yes. All right, here's another question. When do you think the language of flowers was lost from mainstream knowledge? So Brent, do you want to try that one?
About the time of the First World War, or immediately after. And it may just have been discarded as something that was too ridiculous to think about at a time of large-scale massacre and warfare. But certainly by the middle of the 1930s, anybody who mentioned the language of flowers was treating it as, look at this peculiar phenomenon of earlier times. Would you have believed it?
All right.
And so many of the historical books and things that were coming out, especially around 1938 and 39, and then through the 40s, the publications just ceased during World War II. But I think you're absolutely right about World War I, where it just kind of waned.
Next, these are marvelous, rare books. Could the panel recommend a good contemporary book to use as a reference and its publication date?
I think we can talk about Brent again. Brent, do you want to show your book? There you go. We're thinking the same.
Brent had mentioned the Vanessa Diffenbaugh book, The Language of Flowers, published in 2011.
Right.
And that's a novel. And she wrote the introduction to a publication that same year called A Victorian Flower Dictionary, the Language of Flowers Companion. So meant to be as a kind of companion to Vanessa Diffenbaugh's novel. And so that is one quite current book, 2011, published by Ballantine Books in New York. And it's under the author's name, Mandy Kirkby.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And I want to say that in Vanessa Diffenbaugh's book, I think she referred a lot to Henrietta Dumont, if I remember correctly. I remember reading it and doing a book conversation with a library and bringing rare books to them. And I think she used Dumont.
Yeah.
Okay. Did the metaphors of the flowers change when the Linnaean sexual system was superseded by the natural system of classification? Anyone want to try that one?
Go ahead, Brent. I think you can answer that.
That's Brent. Yes.
Were you addressing me or Anne?
No, I think you. What do you say?
Okay. The Language of Flowers book started to appear just as the natural system was superseding the Linnaean system. So there wasn't really a language of flowers based very intelligibly on Linnaeus's classification.
And since the theme of love, which is the informing notion for Linnaean botany, for a popular reader, that changes with the natural system. So they're going like this. They're two different things.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Anne, a question for you. Anne, I think I heard you speak about the influence of the Renaissance on both language of flowers and the language in the arts, both artisanate and high school, domestic, and other branches of art. Did I hear this right? Is there a connection between the language of flowers and flowers in various forms of art?
I keep the notion of the language of flowers to the 19th century. That's what I've learned from you all. We want to keep it there. And there's bound to be crossover between what readers of the language of flower books would take from it and their interest in art. It's some of it's the same audiences for women and for people with general interest in 19th century art and culture. So I think it is the kind of integration of arts and culture and letters, especially in popular books and in popular books about plants. So I think that those who would do watercolors are those who might do embroidery, and those who might be interested in wax flowers and making them and appreciating them and reading about them and gardening. It's the crossover. It seems such an amalgam. Brent, do you agree with that?
Pretty largely. I'd say that's a very global sort of statement, and
Yes.
be able to find lots of detail on which to argue about that. But that sounds to me a reasonable orientation, shall we say, toward approaching the subject.
Fair enough.
The illustrations are so wonderful, and many books that had beautiful illustrations or maps have been disbound. Has that happened to the language of flower books at all? And I can answer that one, yes. Because we have in our collection, assumed we had illustrations, and then we go to our copy, and lo and behold, the beautiful illustration is not intact as we would have expected it. But what happens with botanical art is that the beautiful hand-colored illustrations can be separated from their original, from their books and put on people's walls and whatnot. But these books are smaller, so I think perhaps it happens less in that sense, but they were also less expensive, so perhaps it happened more. I don't know, but I know it has happened. Anyone else want to take a stab at that one?
Well, I've definitely seen being marketed as individual prints, plates taken from language of flowers books. So I assume it's a fairly widespread practice.
Yeah, I've seen it on the internet, and even yesterday I looked through things and saw little, even that John Herford, little bits everywhere, you know, Pinterest and all these marketing places just have, they're just selling it, so.
All right, there was a language of fans, which was put into practice. So why not the same for a language of flowers? Also,
Yes.
the Victorian tussie mussy was in a way of using language of flowers by young women. The tussie mussies, the little bouquets and nosegays. Does anyone want to, Stacy, you want to tackle the?
I think that's for you. That's definitely for you, Leora, to answer.
Are anyone? Brent, definitely. There was the little, the streets were smelly, so you would have, I'm not even sure what era I'm in, a little bouquet that you could put under your nose with fresh smelling scent and walk through the streets of a busy London to have a better scent where you're going.
That could be
And
any
is
time
that
until the
a level?
automobile replaced the horse.
Can you repeat that?
That could be any time until the automobile replaced the horse.
automobile, yes.
There's the delightful book with the title Tussie Mussies, done by Geraldine Adamich Laufer, Laufer, 1993 in New York.
That is
Cute
a-
and fun.
Mhm. All right. Will a list of books be made available? Perhaps of what? So I will say that a recording of this program will be on the Caxton Club website and also the Chicago Botanic Garden website. We have used so many books between the four of us that we have not put them into a bibliography or a list, but most of them you will find on the Biodiversity Heritage Library, where you can actually read through each page of each book. And we have that BHL website will be in about 5 minutes. We'll show you the website, so you can take your phone and take a copy of that. So many questions, so many good questions. Okay. All right, what is library script? Which I mentioned, there were books for librarians on what handwriting to use to inscribe card catalog cards from long ago. And they used a particular script to write their card catalog. So before typewriters, obviously before computers. So they could all know what they were reading. And they're very, very fancy and curly. I don't know what font to think of, but Stace?
I'm thinking it's not Fractor, that's for sure. I don't know. Oh yeah, just if you were looking at one of the scripts, it's just called a script on as a font on one of the on your computer. So I guess it would just be script.
Okay, question specifically for Anne. I wonder if you could talk a little more about the potential of historical investigations into, for example, Victorian flowers in the contemporary rise of critical interest into plant-human relations.
Oh, it's a fascinating question, because there is so much wonderfully exciting theoretical work in critical plant studies and feminist plant studies. So I think you could probably take almost any one of the books and then read it in conjunction with, say, Michael Marder or Kate Sandiland, my colleague Kate Sandilands, or others who are writing in this area, or Peter of Wolleben, who wrote the book The Hidden Language of Tree, The Hidden Life of Trees. And there's a new German collection, for those of you who are German readers, on floriography, Die Sprachen der Blumen, that just came out a couple of years ago with all the kind of younger generation that are picking up these topics about sentience and agency all together, and topics of communication among plants. The ethnobotanical work that I was talking about was plants have so much to give us. All we have to do is ask. That's Mary Sissip-Genius, and there are a whole bunch of those as well. There's a journal called Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, Technoscience, that had a whole special issue on the vegetal turn in scholarship. I'm just beginning to explore it as much as I would like to itself. And there's no question that we are talking about different kinds of communication across species. And how do we do that? And do we show it in formulaic languages, say, of chemistry, or how about showing it in terms of motion in plants, different ways of responding as well? I was thinking, Laura, if you were to ask us something about what our favorite language of flower, what our favorite flower is, in fact, what would I say? And I kind of love to see what everyone would. And so I thought I would say mimosa. I would say the Mimosa sensitiva, the Mimosa pudica, precisely because it can be thought about and read in so many different ways. Is it humility? Is it chastity? Is it virtue? For Erasmus Darwin, the mimosa is the bride, the young woman on the brink of marriage. So it's a sensate with sexual allure and possibility. It can go so many ways. It's also a touch me not plant. It's either a touch me or a touch me not. So depending on how you see it. So it's the unpacking, and that's the kind of image that you can in fact use to truly interrogate what we mean when we talk about languages altogether. How much is cultural? How much is natural? How much is natural cultural?
Wow, thank you. Cool. Do you have a favorite flower, Stacy, Brett?
Hydrangea, I think, is my favorite. And it's kind of, I forget what now I remembered that it was just overwhelming and effusive or something was what it means. But it is one of my favorites.
Brett, favorite flower, language of flower?
I have not thought about this question, and nothing is rushing into my mind.
Stacy, a question for you. When was the quote, your self-love and stupidity evade my pity written, and its book title?
Oh, I can get you that in just a sec. Let me just take a look. I think it was 1836. And that is, let's see. I've got it here. I almost want to say that was part of Thomas Miller's. Mm-hmm. All right, get back to me. I'll tell you in a second.
We've been doing this for 4 hours. We are almost out of time. Final thoughts from the panelists. Oh, sorry, that's the timer. That's my timer. Final thoughts?
I would say, having learned so much from you all, it's such a mashup. At this point, I don't know what to think about these books. Clearly, there's not going to be one approach that will begin to unpack it, because they seem to perform so many different purposes over this quite a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that question about your self-love and stupidity evade my pity, that was from Henrietta Dumont's Floral Offering. And I can't see it, but I think it's 1858.
And final thoughts, Brent, Stacy?
Go ahead, Brent.
Well, I look forward to seeing what emerges from this, and whether this prompts anybody to researching in new directions.
I really like Rusty's idea about, and Brent, about coming up with, more modern thoughts and, meanings. And I think we should get back together again and talk about that sometime.
It's a lovely idea.
Mm-hmm. And I would say I have so many more questions now than I did before. So many things unanswered, so much more to learn. So every time there's just so many more ways to go with this. It's such a simple little game, or insignificant or very significant set of books, and leading out to so many different directions. So.
Could I say one further thing, and that is to thank you for what you've done to bring us together and to give us this opportunity. When I think about how much I've learned from this, and then from the other libraries where I've been able to work, I had just the privilege of doing some research at the Hunt Institute for Botanical Documentation some years ago, and that was one of the first places I looked. And thinking about the Botany Library and the Natural History Museum and the British Museum and other places where I've worked, it's your collections that make it possible for people like me to ask these kind of questions and look for evidence and then reflect on it.
And it's, as librarians, it's the best thing that we could hear. Assad, people examining,
Yeah.
re-examining the works we work so hard at organizing. All right, and if so, we could have the final slide, the final thought slide on the screen. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. There were so many groups that were here with us today, the Smithsonian Advisory Board members, Caxton Club members, colleagues and friends from the Biodiversity Heritage Library and the Council on Botanical and Horticultural Libraries, European Botanical and Horticultural Libraries, of course, the Chicago Botanic Garden. And we, as speakers, we've so enjoyed sharing our passion for the language of flowers with you. And so I definitely want to thank our speakers so much. And Rusty Steyer, Brent Elliott, Stacy Stoltz for your inspiration and for your presentations. And Zarko, for your seamless tech work behind the scenes. Thank you so much for putting us all together. It's virtual, the virtual realm is challenging. And so the final thoughts slide is this, can we put this spotlight, the final thought slide? And make it large. So here we have our contact information and the Biodiversity Heritage Library link, the Lenhart Library link, and the RHS Libraries link. So if you want to take a photo, you can capture all of this or print screen and keep these email addresses and links for the future. And so there's more questions. We did not get to answer all of them. So if you want to put your questions to the Facebook page at the Chicago Botanic Garden, we'll get the answers through through social media, and then we can all engage with the answers a little bit more. And so we have put together a quick exit poll with only 3 yes or no questions. So if you could answer that for us, we'd love to get your feedback on the symposium. And then with that, we'll say good afternoon, good evening, and goodbye. And everyone, here's the panelists. Oops, there's my, that must be 2 o'clock. If the panelists wanna all say goodbye, we'll say goodbye. And thank you for being here with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Leora. Thanks for having us all. And thanks, Brent and Rusty. You guys were just did amazing talks. You as well, Leora. And it was an honor for me to be amongst you.
And my thanks to you all very much.
Same here.